This happened a few years ago in South Utah. My family and I have some friends that live on the Navajo Res, near the bottom of Utah. Our family is in Navajo, but my parents had met some friends a while back who are. Now, my parents had always told me about the legends that their friends had told them. I was never really scared of them because, to be honest, I didn't believe they were real. Well, we had talked to our friend Joey about coming down to the res and camping with him for a few days. He was on board with the idea, and we made plans to drive from Salt Lake City down to the campsite, which was about 10 miles into the res. It was a pretty normal road trip most of the way, and we stopped by a few towns to take pictures and eat. But we had decided that we were going to make it to the campsite in one day. We had been driving from 6 in the morning to 3 in the morning, and we were all tired as hell. I had been sleeping in the back while my father drove and was talking to my mother. My parents started to wake me up because they said we were about to pass the welcome sign to the Navajo Nation. I looked out the window and waited a few minutes before I could see the sign, and kept my eyes on it until we passed. I remember watching the sign, waiting to feel the bump in the road where the pavement changes. As we passed, the back of the sign came into view, and I looked over the backseat to watch the sign until it was out of sight. But when I turned around to look at it, I saw something standing behind it. It looked like a deer standing on its hind legs, but it looked broken. The entire form of the deer looked wrong, and I could see that it was staring at us, and I stared at it for a few seconds while it was still illuminated by our backlights. I turned back around and wanted to tell my mother what I had seen, but by the look on her face I could tell that she had also seen it. My mom explained what we had both seen to my dad, who said it was most likely a statue or something and that we were just tired. My mom insisted, and my dad said we would ask Joey about it when we got to the campsite. While we pulled up to the campsite, Joey and 2 of his friends were sitting around a campfire talking. We were welcomed, hugged, and greeted each other and began setting up our tent. Once we had everything set up, my mom and I got into the same tent and started to go to sleep while my father stayed outside to talk to Joey for a little bit. I wasn't really listening as they were talking, but I started to pay attention as my dad began asking Joey about this thing that we had seen. Right as my father got to the description of it, Joey became quiet, and I could hear him whispering to my father in a hurried tone. All I could hear my dad say, "But we just got here." About a minute after that, my dad quickly got into the tent with us and told us that we needed to go. My mom and I were annoyed by this. That's until we saw that Joey and his friends were also packing up their stuff as quickly as they could. I asked what was going on, but the only answer I could get was, "Just get in the damn car right now." The scariest part at that moment was the way Joey was looking around the campsite. I had never seen my dad, or anybody else, move so quickly and pack everything up. As soon as we got everything in the vehicles, Joey told us we needed to stay somewhere off the res, and that he and his friends would escort us. He made it very clear that we needed to stay on the phone with him until we got to a hotel. We all agreed and began to drive back from where we came. It was mostly a silent ride until we started coming up on a wall of rocks in the road. As soon as we could tell what it was, Joey started screaming in the phone that we needed to either go through it or go around it, but that we needed to do it quickly. My dad drove around the rocks, carefully moving the vehicle, trying not to pop a tire, while still trying to make it out of there quickly. As we started pulling back onto the road, that's when we heard a scream, or more like a screech, coming from in front of the vehicle, maybe about 50 feet away. Joey only said, "Keep driving," which was enough to prompt my dad into driving faster than he had ever driven before. We made it to a hotel, and Joey refused to speak about what just happened. The only thing he said was that we needed a blessing of some sort before we left. We didn't want to, but seeing what happened earlier, we were gonna go with whatever Joey wanted. I never really believed in, well, I'm not gonna say their name, But after reading up on them and comparing the stories online to my own, I firmly believe they're out there. About 3 weeks ago, I drove my son out to a national park for a little weekend camping trip. We took the 410 out from Tacoma into Mount Rainier, a place that my own dad used to take me when I was a kid. I wanted my son, David, who's 2.5, to find the same joy in the wilderness that I had, but I'm quite convinced that he will be terrified of the forest for the rest of his life. When we arrived on Friday, the weather was crisp, and the first signs of spring had finally made themselves known. We walked, or rather I walked with David on my shoulders, for about 2, maybe about 3 hours from the parking lot, into a small desolated camping ground with a pre-made fire pit. I'm not a very overprotective parent, so I let David wobble around a bit while I set up the tent. I heard David make some sounds from behind me. Now, I quickly recognized these sounds as the ones that he makes when he's excited about something. I turned around and saw him sitting in the grass, about 20 feet away, staring into the woods. Even more strange, he was doing this thing he does when he's excited about something, in which he'll start slapping both of his legs quickly. I slowly walked over while trying to keep an eye on both him and the woods at the same time, but there was nothing in the tree line that I could make out. When I was finally by his side, I asked him what he had seen, and at this, his response was, "Monkey Man." He was smiling, still slapping his legs as much as I tried to match his excitement like a good parent should do. Suddenly, the serenity of the woods was replaced by a sense of unease. I once again fixed my eyesight on the tree line and peered in very carefully. It was just such an incredibly strange thing for him to say. I picked David up, not wanting to leave him alone anymore, at least until I could regain some clarity, and walked into the tree line. I don't know how many of you are parents, but the last thing you want to do when you're taking your kid out for a fun weekend is to scare them. I mention this because the sensible thing might have been to hush him, to tell him to keep quiet for a while. But then, I also knew that realistically, this was most likely his imagination. After a few minutes of scouting around with David up on my shoulders, I decided to return to camp. It was about 3:30, I believe, so I made us some lunch, still keeping an eye out on the space at which David had been clapping and yapping just a few minutes before. As much as I try to forget it, I just couldn't. I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in aliens, in the paranormal, or even in Bigfoot. But I suppose my parental instinct was simply in too much of a high gear for me to let it go. As the cold sun was setting, I decided to ask David a bit more about what he had seen. As I was getting the fire going, I asked him about the monkey man. I asked him if it was a big monkey man. David thought about it for a second, then laughed and nodded. I then asked him if he seemed like a nice monkey man, and David, once again, started to giggle. I wasn't really sure what else to ask. I read a chapter from a book to him as he fell asleep in his sleeping bag. When I fell asleep myself, I had almost forgotten about the monkey man. I awoke in pitch darkness. The fire pit was out. I reached out to feel for David, and panic struck me hard. He wasn't next to me. He wasn't even in the tent itself, with only my underwear on. I stormed out but realized it was too dark to see anything. So I dropped back into the tent and tore my flashlight out of my bag. In the meantime, I was screaming his name. With only the weak beam of a flashlight, I didn't think I would ever have to actually rely on. I pointed it around in circles, still calling out for David. For some reason, I ran towards the spot at which David had been so transfixed in the daytime. I shouted his name into the trees as I trotted inward into the pitch-black woods. I was so desperate that I didn't even notice my feet getting scraped up by the bark and stone. After only about a minute of walking, I saw something that made me drop the flashlight. David was standing there, peering into the darkness, very still. I grabbed onto him, beginning to sob, still clutching him tightly. I picked up the flashlight again, which had been beaming at the ground, and looked around for a moment, fending off the darkness. I could see nothing around. As I carried him back looking over my shoulder, I asked him what happened. He replied that he didn't know, and that he was tired. David had sleepwalked before, so I was just chalking it up to that. That night, I locked up the tent from the inside with a padlock. I only got about 3 hours of good rest. David himself slept like a rock, despite my trembling embrace. The following morning, I made some breakfast. David couldn't remember what happened, and seemed pretty satisfied to continue the trip. I thought it would be careless to shrug off last night's events as mere sleepwalking, especially considering the monkey man business. But I also thought it would be a bit too silly to cancel the entire trip over it. So I made a promise to myself that if anything else were to happen, we would drive back to Tacoma at a moment's notice. The rest of the day was actually quite nice, and it helped me take my mind off things. David was a bit upset about not having the iPad, but eventually discovered that nature can be just as cool as pixels. We made some bark boats with faces on them, and sent them downstream. We watched some squirrels, listened to the birds. It was everything that I was hoping the trip would be. At dusk, when the trees stretched long shadows across the grass, David was getting too cold and too tired to play anymore, so I decided we would spend the rest of the day inside the tent. I had brought along this game where you have to trace the outline of a person with a small metal rod, and if your aim is off, it makes a funny sound, almost like that game Operation. I don't remember what it was called, but David always found it funny. It's a simple game, but they told us that it helps develop motor skills. When it was David's turn, he made a mistake, and the little speaker made the sound again, and David started laughing. But what happened next filled me with a sense of fear that I doubt anything will ever match. From about 50 feet away, I heard the exact same laugh that David had made, only it was much deeper. It was almost like when you record yourself speaking and then lower the pitch down. I froze, and this time, I couldn't hide my fear from David. I could tell by his face that he had also heard it. I lifted my finger to my lips to communicate to him that we needed to be quiet. It was at this moment that I also noticed that the sun had completely set. I had also just realized how quiet the woods had become. Every second felt like an eternal minute as we sat there in the tent, absolutely still, surrounded by thick silence. When the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears finally ceased, I leaned over slowly towards my backpack to retrieve my handgun out of it. I never go into the woods without it. I turned around to face David. I noticed that he had picked up the game again, so I sternly removed it from his hand and whispered in a stern tone, "Not now, David." Then, just as I had said it, a broken voice whispered, inches away from the tent, "Not now, David." The only thing I remember happening next is that I started shooting into the fabric of the tent in the direction of the sound. David was screaming, and the gunshot rang throughout the woods. Then I heard what sounded like some fading footsteps of something sprinting away. With my hands trembling, I opened the padlock and jumped out with a flashlight in my left hand, aiming the faint beam into the darkness. I grabbed David, stuffed everything that I could within arm's reach into the backpack, and just ran. The way back was the scariest. There was not a second at which I did not feel as if something was right behind us, ready to leap out from the darkness. The only thing I could say to David was, "It's alright, David, you'll get the iPad soon." Nothing did ever leap out, nor did I hear anything except the rushing of the wind and the running stream by the trail side. I was so out of it that even in the car, I kept checking the backseat to see if there was something sitting behind us, ready to kill us. I'm not sure how to explain it to you, or to anybody, not even David's pediatrician, about what happened. I haven't even told his mother the full story, only that I thought someone came up to our tent, and that I had to fire a warning shot. Needless to say, David hasn't been the same since. He has been getting constant headaches, which might be from the damage to his ears by the gunshot. I'm not sure how to end this story, but one thing is for sure: never take your kids into Mount Rainier National Park. Some people would call me a professional outdoorsman. I spend a lot of time out in the wilderness, fishing, hiking, camping, but best of all, hunting. I love to go hunting, ever since I was a kid, even though I have my father to blame for that. While other children were out riding bikes or having sleepovers, I was clutching a rifle next to my father to stay warm in the cold mornings. My father and I spent almost every fall together up there on the mountain. He would teach me about the various wildlife and all the different types of plants, which ones were safe and which ones weren't. He also taught me how to track and how to maintain firearms. I remember the first time I saw my first buck. He stood there between two rows of trees, only 50 meters away from me. I leveled my rifle at him, looked him square in the eye, and squeezed the trigger. I missed, and the deer ran off into the woods to live another day. I felt defeated that day, but my father, even though he was strict, was very understanding of my shortcomings. He told me even the best hunters in the world miss. That made me feel better, at least a little bit. The years seemed to fly by, and I had hunted nearly every type of game in those mountains. Even though I was having fun, I never let a kill go to waste. I would always bring back what I killed to stock my freezer for the following months. After high school, I got a job working as a camp supervisor on the mountain. It wasn't anything amazing. Mostly, I would just sit there and read magazines all day, sometimes having to tell a group of frat guys to keep the noise down, or reminding the scatterbrained father to keep an eye on the campfire. Like I said, it was pretty boring stuff, but I did get to be closer to nature almost non-stop. And not to mention, the campgrounds closed at the start of the fall hunting season and reopened the following year. I had just packed up my truck and said goodbye to my mom. I did this every single year, and yet my mother would always tell me how much she worries about me. My father, on the other hand, would always tell me not to come home unless I bagged something bigger than my truck. The following morning, I woke up an hour or so before dawn, got in my truck, and drove to the mountain. I had my own personal spot I would park my truck at, which was a narrow path that ended about halfway up the mountain. I hopped out, grabbed my gear, my rifle, and took a deep breath before walking into the woods. Around 20 minutes of walking, the sun had just started to creep over the horizon, its rays igniting the sky above me. That was always one of my favorite parts about being outdoors so early. I continued my hike through the terrain, over logs, and through the dense brush. It wasn't long after I arrived at a clearing. I figured this was a good place as any to set up camp for the night. Whenever I go hunting, I stay out for a few days at a time, just to give me more opportunities. I had quickly set up a small one-man tent and created a small fire pit. The sun was almost directly overhead at this point. Even though I was still busy situating my surroundings, I couldn't help but feel eyes on me. I backed out of my tent, my rifle in hand, and scanned the tree line around me. Another good lesson that I picked up from when I was young was to always trust your instincts out here when you're hunting. I thought maybe a bear was getting too curious for its own good. I grinned at the thought of my dad's face if I managed to actually bring back something as large as my truck, but I quickly reminded myself how dangerous these animals could be. I stood there motionless, listening, and scanning everything around me. After 5 minutes of nothing, I returned to my tent, but still more alert than ever. Finally satisfied with how my camp looked, I quickly scarfed down 3 protein bars and a bottle of water before venturing into the woods. It wasn't long before I caught the trail of a small herd of deer not too far ahead of me. I took notes of each broken twig, grazing spot, and pile of droppings along the way. Just as I was about to peek my head through some underbrush, a deer jumped out at me. This caused me to jump and fall on my back hard. Before I knew it, 2 more of them followed, as they all scampered past me, disappearing into the woods before I could even ready my rifle. Rising to my feet, I couldn't help but notice the strange behavior. Normally, deer don't run towards a hunter like that. Usually always they run in the opposite, unless something else has scared them first. I peeked my head back through the underbrush and noticed something strange. There was a deer lying on the ground in a pool of its own blood. Its entire throat and chest seemed to have been torn from its body. I could feel a mix of curiosity and concern rise in my mind. I wonder what could have possibly done this. And I also wonder how I didn't hear it happening with how close it was. While I was lost in thought, I heard the rustling of twigs and leaves on the far end of the deer. I looked up and caught a glimpse of something, only for a moment. But whatever it was, it looked gray. Maybe a wolf. But it still doesn't explain why I didn't hear it, nor why it didn't stick around to eat its prey. I decided it was best to start making my way back to camp. The sun was now on its descent, and I didn't want to be out in the woods after dark. It's very easy to get lost at night. The twilight was growing in the sky with each passing moment. I tried to quicken my pace, but I knew I wasn't going to make it back to camp before the sun had fully set. Still, I continued on, trying my best not to think about the possibility of a wolf lurking around, because if there's one, there's most likely a pack around. I began to get that feeling again of somebody's eyes on me, from some unknown location. I could feel my hands gripping my rifle as I continued to walk. Then, a rustling of leaves and crackling of twigs caused me to stop and aim with my rifle. It was 2 squirrels chasing each other around the tree. With a heavy sigh of relief, I lowered my guard and turned back. But when I did, I saw something that froze me. There was something attached to a tree directly in front of me. It looked like a man, but not really. Its body was a grayish blue color, and it was gripping onto the tree with large claw-like fingers. I felt sweat run down the side of my face despite the cold temperature outside. Its head was twitching about as if it were looking for something. Slowly, I raised my rifle towards it, but when I did this, it caused the creature to stop twitching its head and look directly at me. Its eyes seemed to reflect the light from some unknown source. They shimmered lightly in the dusk. I wasn't sure what I was actually looking at, but my instinct told me that it wasn't friendly. I steadied my breath, lined up the shot, and fired. The gunshot echoed through the forest as birds and other creatures scurried away from the sound. The bullet hit the creature, and when it did, a new sound replaced the gunshot. The creature let out a shriek. I chambered another round, not wanting to take a chance. Yet when I did, the creature was gone. I scanned the trees and the nearby ground, but there was no sign of it. I know I had hit it, but I wasn't about to stick around to make sure. I continued my journey back to camp, but when I got there, I found my entire campsite completely ransacked. My tent was shredded, and all my supplies had been scattered about. Just then, I heard something behind me. I slowly turned, and was only a few feet away from this creature that I had just shot. It was on all fours, crawling, still twitching its head as it moved. I could see it much more clearly now, even with the light missing from the sky. The skin on its mouth looked torn, and its jaw was hanging loosely, as it was breathing silently. Its eyes were completely white, almost as if it were blind. I shifted my body slightly to face the creature, and when I did, it stopped crawling. Its milky eyes were looking directly into mine, and in a split second, I pulled my rifle up and fired, but that didn't do anything to stop it. It leaped through the air and knocked me down. Its large claw-like fingers were scraping at me while its mouth, filled with razor-sharp teeth, snapped in my face. I was trying my hardest to keep it from biting me by holding it back with the body of my rifle. But this thing was strong. I rocked from one side to the other and used the momentum to throw the creature off of me. It scrambled to its feet, but I was faster this time. I took a quick breath and squeezed the trigger, catching the creature in the head. It wheezed and fell back. That's when I got up and began running towards my truck. I looked back only once, and when I did, of course, I saw no sign of the creature I had just shot. Panic set in as I jumped over logs and tore my clothing on branches. I was just praying that I was going the correct way the entire time. As I was running, I started to feel more and more eyes on me, as if the entire mountain was now aware of my presence. I went around a small hill and almost screamed when I saw my truck. I got into it and drove out of there. When I made it home, my mother was happy, and my father was concerned at all my cuts and wounds. I told him that a bear had attacked me and that I had narrowly made it back. I couldn't bring myself to tell them what I really saw up there. Weeks went by, and I couldn't shake what I had experienced. I doubt I ever will. I have since quit my job at the campgrounds, and I have started looking for jobs closer to town. I have hunted everything up on that mountain, but that night was the first time that something had hunted me. I don't think I'm ever gonna go back to that mountain, and if you plan on going into the wilderness, be careful. A wolf or a bear aren't the only things lurking within the trees. I've been a park ranger for the better part of a decade. It's both a demanding job and one filled with enjoyment. I'm sure some people out there don't care too much about the great outdoors, but I do. I remember back when I was a kid, I would spend countless summers begging my parents to take me camping at the park. My mother wasn't too thrilled with the idea, but my father would still take me, even if she wasn't up to it. My dad and I would spend almost every summer out in the woods, hiking and fishing. It was the age-old cliche of father-son bonding time, but I suppose it's a cliche for a reason, right? I never grew tired of it, even as I grew up. Eventually, I learned that you could make a living working in a place like this. At the time, I had very little concept of park rangers and what they do. To me as a kid, I just thought that there were police officers with funny hats. Don't tell anyone, but I still kind of think that. After high school, I went to college, and during my last 2 years, I was lucky enough to get a job as an intern at a park not too far from the school. I would mostly do errands, but often the rangers would take me out on ride-alongs. We would drive around in a pickup truck and just enjoy the scenery. Sometimes, they would have to tell a couple of people to hit the bricks, but other than that, everything else was a breeze. After finishing college, I applied to become a ranger myself, and was lucky enough to be selected. It's a highly competitive market, so being chosen was huge for me. My very first day on the job, I'll never forget it, mostly because everyone I worked with never let me forget it. I was walking out of the ranger lookout. I guess I wasn't paying attention, and I missed a step. I tumbled down the stairs, spilling my coffee all over me. I swear the laughing could be heard for miles. Aside from that unfortunate misstep, it's been an enjoyable ride, to say the least. Over the course of my career, I dealt with numerous events. The first major one that I could remember would have to be the time a group of kids had gotten a hold of some fireworks, which aren't permitted in the park. They had set a few of them off, and we were called out to investigate. We arrived at the location not long after the report was made, and lucky for everybody, no damage was done to the park or the kids. We escorted them back and called their parents to come pick them up. One kid damn nearly wet his pants when I told him that I spoke with his mom. I couldn't blame him. She sounded like the wrath of God even when she was speaking to me. Other than that, there have been a few domestic disputes at the nearby campgrounds. Those happen actually quite frequently. People often get stupid when they get drunk. So we calmed them down or asked them to leave. And since they don't want to pick up camp, most of the time they just go to sleep. But the worst day was a couple of years ago when a local kid from a nearby town had gone missing. We were all called in to be part of the search effort. Apparently, the boy had wandered into the woods and had gotten lost. We searched and searched for days, but in the end, were unsuccessful. I still remember his face on the flyer that his parents had made. But that brings me to the scariest day working as a park ranger. I'm sure that's why you're all listening anyway. It was a slower day in between spring break and summer vacation. During that time, there's a lot of visitors, so our roster was somewhat spread out. Not to mention, we had some people retire recently, which actually left us pretty short-handed. I was stationed in the main ranger building at the entrance of the park, while Alan, another ranger, would be at the lookout further inward. After checking in and getting situated at the start of my shift, I watched out of one of the nearby windows as Alan hopped in one of the trucks and drove it to the lookout. I waited around 10 minutes before getting on the radio and telling him that one of his taillights was out. Another few minutes passed before he hopped on the radio and told me that he was halfway up the stairs, then had to head back down to check, and they were both fine. I laughed through the receiver, and I could hear him already pulling a prank on me. The day progressed and I did a few patrols in the mornings, just to take some time to enjoy my surroundings. The nearby lake was glistening with the morning sun. Along the trail, I saw two hikers who returned a friendly wave as I drove by. I stopped by the campgrounds to see if we had any new campers, and was surprised to find it empty. Regardless of the time of year, there's at least one die-hard outdoors person staying here, but not this time. I didn't pay it much mind. After all, it was less work for me. Once noon rolled around, a massive cloud seemed to appear out of nowhere. They didn't look to be storm clouds, but were thick enough to block out the sun's rays. I dreaded having to drive around in the rain, so I hoped the weather would be okay. Nighttime was fast approaching as the overcast sun descended. I radioed to Alan to see if everything was fine, and he reported nothing out of the ordinary. The park after sunset was very beautiful. The stars that normally fill the night sky are a sight to behold, and the sounds of the nocturnal forest coming to life as a sound is something I'll never forget. About an hour after sunset, Alan got on the radio. "Hey, John," Alan said. "What's up?" I replied. "Come out here, man," he said. The way Alan spoke was strange to me. He sounded a bit nervous, a little bit off. Maybe his nerves were getting the best of him. "Alright, I'll be out there in a minute," I said as I exited the ranger station and hopped into the truck. As I drove out to the lookout, I radioed Alan again to ask him if everything was alright, but the radio just crackled in response. I sighed, thinking he might be using the bathroom or something. Once there, I parked a few yards away from the tower's base. I hopped out of the truck and turned on my flashlight. As I was approaching the stairs, my boots sloshed into the muddy ground. This caught me off guard, as even though there were clouds in the sky all day, it hadn't rained a single time. I lowered my light and saw that the ground had a strange tint to the mud. What was weird was that as I looked at it, I noticed that the muddy ground seemed to lead away from the tower. I followed it to a nearby tree line that surrounded the tower itself. In between two trees, I saw him. Alan, or what was left of him. His body was torn to shreds. His face was completely torn. If not for his uniform, I doubt I would have recognized him. As I was standing over my bloody coworker, the radio crackled to life. "Hello, John," Alan's voice came through. My breathing stopped. "Are you almost here?" he asked. The voice coming through the radio was definitely Alan's, but that was impossible, as I was currently staring at his remains. I snapped my head and looked up to the tower above me. Even though it was dark outside, I could see someone inside of it, a silhouette, standing still through the glass. I then got on the radio. "Alan, are you in the tower?" "Yes," came the response. As soon as whoever it was responded, I made a dash to my truck. As I ran, I looked up and watched this thing run towards the tower's door and begin to descend the stairs. I barely managed to jump inside the truck before whatever it was reached the bottom. I quickly started the engine. To this day, I'm still not sure what was standing in front of me. Its skin was gray from head to toe. Its body seemed muscular, yet lanky at the same time. Long arms and legs protruded out from its torso. I could see the flesh expand and contract with each ragged breath it took. Its face was by far the strangest. Large eyes. The lower half of its face was just a mesh of teeth, some even puncturing its own skin. It raised a long, clawed hand to its mouth, and I could see it was holding something. Suddenly, my radio crackled to life. It said in Alan's voice, "John, are you there?" I floored my truck and ran into the creature as hard as I could. The metal on the truck creaked for a moment before the thing fell to the ground. After that, I reversed out of there, spinning the truck around and driving until I was completely out of the park. I was interviewed by different law enforcement agencies about the events of that night. I tried my best to be honest, but hearing myself explain to the local police that it was a monster sounded insane. The authorities determined that it was most likely an individual who was crazy that attacked Alan, and when they went to go find him, he was nowhere to be found. It's been almost a year since that day, and I have since moved 4 states away, getting a job at a smaller park. Some of you might think that's crazy, but I do still love the outdoors. I just refuse to work once the sun goes down. I try to look up reports of similar incidents, and the closest thing I could find were stories or legends about strange creatures that are called wendigos, the rake, or skinwalkers. I have no idea if that's what I saw that night or not, but here's some advice. If any of you are planning to visit one of your state parks this summer, I would highly recommend it. However, if you're planning on camping at one overnight, please be very careful and never trust the voice when you can't see its face.
Isengloskagen is a forest in far north Norway. I recently moved to Logsalev for work. Even though it was January, I figured that since I was out in the wilderness, that I might as well go out into the woods to explore a bit. There wasn't a whole lot to do in town. Besides, I heard the trails in this part of the country were pretty nice. There was only a few blocks between my house and the edge of the woods. Anyways, I grabbed a bottle of water and a little bag with trail mix. I was going on a trail after all, and off I went. It had snowed the day before. I guess snow is pretty common up here. It was a pretty soft snow, the kind that ski resorts prefer. It would crunch loud as I stepped on it. Despite the trail being covered up by the snow, I was pretty confident in my ability to keep track of the trail, since the forest was somewhat dense, and the opening where the trees were removed was distinguishable, and so I wasn't worried about getting lost. It was still pretty early in the afternoon, only about 1 p.m. I wasn't worried about the sun going down. Then again, I had only moved from Virginia fairly recently, so Norway might as well have been a different planet in terms of climate and daylight. At least, that's what I thought. It might have just been a big change that I was seeing, as being bigger than it was. After about half an hour, I wasn't terribly deep in the woods. I was moving at a pretty slow pace after all. I had passed a lot of scenery, but nothing that really stood out, just a lot of trees, a few which had fallen. It was at this point that I realized something that surprised me just a little bit. I wasn't alone in the woods. I stopped briefly when I noticed that a few flakes were weakly drifting to the ground, and noticed that I could hear something else. I could hear the sound of snow crunching under a human's foot. They didn't sound like they were wearing heavy boots or anything. It was much more quiet. I could only really tell it was a person because it was clearly 2 feet. They sounded distant, just barely close enough for me to actually hear it. The woods were pretty quiet. It wasn't windy or anything like that. That's when I saw her in the distance. A woman. Even though my memory is shaky, I say that she was about the ballpark of about 50 yards away. I could just barely see her moving between the trees, drifting almost casually through the snow. But something struck me about her appearance though, so I knew I had to get closer to her to know if I was right or not. So I pursued her. I didn't want to call out to her yet, but I did begin trying to hurry up. She didn't seem like she was moving very fast, but I was struggling to keep sight of her in the forest. Finally, I was about 10 yards away from her, and now I was close enough to confirm what I thought I had seen before. The woman was completely naked. I figured this woman must need help, that she must have been on something, or she was mentally ill. Nobody walks around in the snowy woods with no clothes on, with nothing on. "Excuse me," I piped up, but she didn't acknowledge me. She must have been on some serious drugs. "Excuse me," I repeated, a bit more loud this time. She kept walking, even though when I said that, her pace had slowed just a little bit. I didn't mean to stare, considering the situation, but she really was gorgeous from what I saw of her. Without going into any details, I'll just say her body, and what little of her face I managed to see, was damn near perfect. I shook off the distraction and began trying to approach her. I got to about 5 yards from her when she suddenly stopped. It was such a sudden thing that I stopped too. "Excuse me, ma'am. Are you okay?" I asked in the best Norwegian I could, even though I knew it wasn't very good. She stood motionless in the forest for a few seconds before quickly turning to me. I then got a good look at her face. She didn't seem bothered by the cold. Her flowing blonde hair looked to have just come from a salon. Her body didn't seem to be reacting to the cold at all. No frostbite, no bluish tint, no shivering, not even one single goosebump. What really struck me about her was her eyes. Her eyes were an icy, cold-looking blue, almost gray. She had no expression, and despite having turned to me, she didn't seem to really notice that I was there. Her face and body language didn't indicate that she was actually acknowledging me. She never looked directly at me. I figured that she must really be on some serious drugs. I stopped for a second or two to think of what she might be on, before remembering her current situation. Ma'am, are you alright?" I repeated. No response. "I can call a hospital for you if you need me to," I offered. At that point, I realized that I didn't bring my cell phone with me. Shit, what would I do now? I had no way of contacting authorities with this drugged up naked lady in the middle of the frozen woods, but I didn't feel comfortable just leaving her out here to go and get help. What if a search team wouldn't be able to find her in time? How long has she been out here anyways? I figured that my best option would be trying to get her to follow me back to town. "Ma'am, would you like my coat?" I offered. It was better than just letting her freeze after all. She didn't react to my question at all, despite the cold. I took my coat off and began to approach her. That's when I noticed something I didn't notice before. Her fingers and toes now seemed to be a blue color. She didn't seem at all frostbitten not a moment ago. Where did that come from so fast? I knew I had to get her out of here, and fast. As I got closer, there was more frostbite I hadn't noticed before on her nose and ears. Suddenly, she turned away from me and began walking away. "Hey, wait!" I called out to her. No response. Suddenly, her pace quickened. A few seconds later, she was running. And a few seconds after that, she was out of sight. "Damn it," I shouted. I would have to try to follow her footprints in the snow now. But that's when I noticed that she wasn't leaving any footprints. What the hell was going on here? A naked lady walking aimlessly in the middle of a Norwegian winter with randomly appearing frostbite, and she wasn't leaving any footprints? Was she on drugs? Or was I? I thought about just turning back and trying to go back to town, but I still thought it would be better to find her and lead her back. I would just grab her and carry or drag her if necessary. I wasn't gonna let this lady freeze to death while I could do something about it, even if she was apparently levitating. It was then at that point that I realized that I didn't know where I was. In my attempts to get to her, I had lost track of the trail. Well, now I felt stupid. My own footprints, I thought. I turned around and found that my footprints were also gone. My trail now just started where I was standing at the moment. Had the snow filled them in, or was I going crazy? I know for a fact, though, that I wasn't levitating. It was at this revelation that I was becoming afraid. Something was, seriously, wrong here. What could I do now? I didn't know where the lady was anymore, and I didn't know how to get back to town, even if I did find her. This place is a big expanse of forest. It eventually extends back to a mountain range. Unfortunately, the trees were too thick to see the mountains for reference. Where the fuck was I? I could see one thing, however. The sun was starting to go down. The sun goes down pretty early around here. I guess it was a mistake to go out this late, since I figured I would have been home by now. I decided that all I could really do was just start walking the same direction I thought I had come from. I picked the direction that had been directly behind me when I lost sight of the woman. I figured that if I could find the trail, it would be easy. But I felt terrible leaving her that way. But I needed to know where the hell I was before I could effectively help her. I was now considering just rushing home and calling the authorities to be the best available option. But first, I needed to find home. I walked for what felt like hours, through snow and trees, without ever finding a trail. I didn't know if my mind was playing tricks on me, similar to my footprints disappearing, or if I had actually gone in the wrong direction. I paused to look around when I noticed a woman walking off in the distance. Relative to where I was, she was at 3:30, about 20 yards away. I stared at her for a few seconds, realizing that she was actually looking at me. The fact that she was looking at me was creepier than when she wasn't. I was frozen in place, too confused to approach her. I knew I needed to help her, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to anymore. All of this seemed so off. She then began taking a few slow steps towards me, to where I was. I don't know why, but I was getting scared now. I took a few steps back to attempt to match the ground she was gaining on me. She didn't seem determined to get to me. In fact, despite looking at me, she didn't seem like she actually noticed me. I was, for some reason, apprehensive to turn away from her and just run. I was still clinging to the idea that this was just some normal woman out of her mind on drugs. who also needed my help. My own pace was beginning to slow down. I don't know why, but I wanted to get away from her for some reason. But my body just wasn't moving the way it should have been. On top of that, I was so cold. It was like ice was forming in my blood, and she was catching up to me pretty quickly. "Ma'am, if you need help, I can help you," I said. "We can get back to town. Lakasalev, you know where that is, right? It's just on the outside of the woods here. Do you want me to help you?" No response. I looked down and noticed that her hands and feet were frostbitten. There was also patches of frostbite all over her body now. Had her condition become more severe? When she got closer, the frostbite was also on her lips, turning them a blue color. Her chest and face were slowly becoming flushed in a frosty blue. "Ma'am, your frostbite is getting worse. We need to get you to town. Here, take my coat," I said. I was actually becoming panicked at her bizarre behavior and this entire situation. There really was something severely wrong here. A large clump of snow fell from a branch above my head and crashed on my head. It didn't hurt, but I had to wipe the snow from my eyes. It took little effort getting it out. I looked up from my struggle to notice her now standing very close to me, nearly 3 feet away. That's when I lost it. I began to will myself away from her. I took off running, not caring which way I was heading anymore. As long as I could get away from that monster, that thing, she wasn't human. Or if she wasn't a normal human. When I looked up at her that time, her body was completely covered in frostbite. Her entire skin was a deep blue color, patches of decay. Her forearms down and her legs on down were skeletal. Her face was mutilated by frostbite. Her ears and nose missing, the rims of her lips missing. Her chest was actually missing entirely, with a large patch of mutilation carved into her chest by frostbite, exposing just a small amount of her rib cage. I was just about out of my mind. I was actually running now. I had no idea where I would end up. I was just hoping to find the edge of the woods before she might have found me. I couldn't tell at all if I was getting closer to safety or further into the woods. Then I kind of wondered if just escaping the woods would be enough. Would she follow me out? I didn't know what to think anymore. That thing, obviously, wasn't human anymore, assuming it ever really was. So I didn't even know if it would conform to human logic. All I could do was cycle through begging not to be found, begging to escape somewhere else, begging to escape somewhere safe, cursing my entire decision to go walking out in the woods, cursing the woods themselves, asking what the hell she was. All of this. It was all I could do while running to avoid going crazy. I don't know what's going on. Maybe it was making the whole thing worse. I ran for what must have been another few hours. And it was dark now. As I was running, I tripped over a root, steered sideways, and slammed my back into a tree. It was now too dark for me to see anything, and I was now too tired to even move. If she were to find me, that's all there was to it. I would have to rest, build up some strength. I backed myself up against the tree I had collided with and stared into the blackness, hoping not to get attacked. I remember the food I brought with me and pulled out my bottle of water. All of the liquid had frozen solid. I found it very strange because I didn't really think it was cold enough for that to happen, especially since it had been in my coat pocket the entire time. Maybe I was going crazy, or maybe I was just losing it. Well, I couldn't drink ice, so I moved on to the trail mix. It was fine and gave me a bit of strength. Stopping to eat actually gave me the chance to try to collect myself. I could really only wonder what the fuck that thing was. Why I was seeing so many weird things going on with the snow and ice. There had to be some kind of connection, but I wasn't about to approach any solid ideas. as to what it was. As I sat in the dark, I could hear snow crunching somewhere. It was pitch black, but I could tell it was somewhere to my right. I was too exhausted to move now. All I could really do was sit against the tree and hope she didn't find me, or at least hope that whatever she would do to me wouldn't be too bad. But for some reason I doubted that. When I looked at her back then, she was looking at me for just a second. When I could see what she really was, that frostbitten body, her eyes stayed, but they were glazed over, like she was drugged or something. For just a second she looked right at me. I can't even think of what she might have wanted to do to me, but I'm not really liking any of my options right now. As I sat there, listening to the distant crunching, I focused so intently. I could feel every single snowflake that was hitting me. They seemed to be getting colder, somehow. The entire forest seemed to be dropping in temperature. I honestly wasn't sure I would live to see her catch me. I might end up freezing first. I was trying to think that maybe I shouldn't just be sitting here, but I couldn't decide which was more dangerous, walking around hoping not to be found, or sitting in one spot hoping not to be found. I wasn't sure what to do either way. I looked behind the tree to still see nothing in the dark. I was pretty quickly darting my eyes and head around, desperately trying to get a visual on something, anything. I couldn't even see the tree I was leaning against. It must have been a new moon or something. I was so paranoid. I was pretty quickly losing track of time. I had no idea what time it might be, but things were starting to get blurry. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because out of nowhere, I opened my eyes to see broad daylight. In hindsight, I kind of wish I'd been able to stay awake. Even though nothing happened, something easily could have. In fact, whatever that thing was, seemed to have such a good grasp on the woods. I'm actually surprised she didn't find me. The only thing I can really think of is that she must have found me, but thought it would be too easy if I was sleeping when she did it. I looked to my right and saw footprints in the snow. Not a trail, just two footprints, side by side, like somebody was hovering over me, landed right there, and flew away. Was she watching me the entire night? Fuck that. I think that might actually be worse than if she caught me, 'cause now I know she's toying with me. I'm not sure if she considered me more prey or a toy, but I didn't like either option. Now that it was morning and I had rested, I decided I needed to start running again, trying to find the trail, the edge of the woods, anything. Honestly, I was sore as hell from all that running, but I guess I couldn't avoid more of it. I started off at a slow walk, keeping my eyes out for whatever that thing might be. This was a bit difficult, since I wanted desperately to just take off and run. I had to think about where I was going, instead of just zipping around blindly. I thought of looking for moss on trees, since I knew the woods were to the southeast of town. Conveniently, the trees had no moss at all, nor did the nearby rocks. I tried to think back on where the sun set last night, but I wasn't awake to see it rise, and I was running so blindly I didn't notice where it set. The sun was currently to my left, but I didn't know what time it was, or what direction that was, so that was worthless. I wish I was an expert tracker. I'm sure some hunter or navigator would be able to get me out of the woods. So now, I just had to walk, hoping I was going in the right direction, hoping I wouldn't run into that thing again. I walked for a while, what had to be about 2 hours or so. I still didn't seem to be anywhere near the edge of the woods. I still couldn't see anything. It was mostly just a flat plain of snow with trees all around it. I kind of wish they had put a sign up at the edge of the woods, warning people not to go into it. Then again, I'm pretty sure a sign that said, "Warning, naked zombie lady," would be dismissed as a joke. At this point, I realized I was stupid and just ate a handful of snow. I completely forgot that snow was just fluffy water, and just went without liquid because my water bottle was frozen. I must have been so confused from where I was exhausted that I didn't even think of it. With that refresher, I began to realize I was being followed again. I could hear the snow crunching from behind me again. I turned to face it, but there was nothing there. I gazed around, but still couldn't see anything. I needed to hurry up before that thing caught up to me, so I got up and kept moving. It was hours later, and I still didn't see any scenery that looked even remotely unique. I had no idea these woods were this big. I realized that nobody really knew me, so nobody would be looking for me either way. I wasn't really counting on that anyways. Honestly, I just needed to find a way out. At this rate, I wasn't sure if I was just walking in circles or not. I could have been for all I knew. At this point, I realized the sun was hanging low. That must have been west. I knew I needed to go northwest, so all I had to do was head in some direction from there. I didn't know where I would come out, but it was worth a shot, so I started walking. I walked for several more hours in what I assumed was a straight line. It didn't seem to be taking me anywhere. I looked up trying to focus on the sun, trying to see which way I was going. Around then, I turned around to see the path where I was coming from. That's when I saw her, the woman, standing directly across from me. She was far enough away that I couldn't see if there was any frostbite on her this time. She didn't look like it, but she was staring directly at me and walking towards me. I was in a better position this time, or at least I thought. I knew where the hell I was going. I turned left and started running towards the sun. I knew that there was a highway that went through a part of the woods. I wasn't so intent on getting to the highway as my definite destination. If she blocks my path directly to town, I can find some semblance of civilization. I ran for a few minutes before realizing that I had lost her, or at least it looked like I did. I wasn't sure anymore. I knew she could be anywhere. I slowed to a stop and surveyed my surroundings. I couldn't see her anywhere, nor any sign of her. A small amount of sunlight was peeking through the trees now, but I could tell it would most likely be setting within the hour. I had to find my way out before that happened. Otherwise, I would lose my only usable reference point. I took off running again, sprinting through the forest, dodging between trees. I had no idea how long I was running for, maybe 45 minutes, but it was also getting darker. I was losing light and my ability to navigate. I could only try to keep running in a single direction, then just keep going that same way once the sun was down. I felt I had a pretty good system now. Surely, I couldn't get lost if I kept in a straight line. The only thing I really had to worry about was getting interrupted. At that point, I crashed into a tree. I had been running for hours. I must have been tired again. My coat wasn't really protecting me from the environment the way it should have been also. As I slowly rose to my feet, I saw an opening in the trees. It was the trail. I had finally found it again. I climbed back to 2 feet and staggered onto it. I felt a lot better knowing I had found a sign that I was on the right track. I then realized I had something of a conundrum. Should I really follow the trail, or should I keep going in a straight line the way I was? I remember seeing a map of the trail outside, seeing that it wasn't just one trail, but a huge network. I don't remember any specific directions, but I knew that just blindly following the trail might not necessarily be a good idea, especially now that I was already on a good path. I decided the trail could screw itself and kept walking in a straight line. It was also very dark now. I could barely see. I couldn't quite move as quickly as I was before, but I wasn't about to just stop. I didn't trust my safety to that monster. It was now practically pitch black again. I didn't know what time it must have been. I had been switching between walking and running for more than 24 hours now. When the fuck would these woods end? These woods couldn't have been this expansive. They just couldn't have been. I must have been just completely lost at this point. I didn't know what to think at that point, and I still didn't know, to be honest. I was lost in thought, and then I realized the sun went down. The night wasn't quite as dark as the night before, but it was still nearly pitch black. I wouldn't just be running blindly anymore, so I kept walking straight. I felt in front of me for trees, groping blindly like an idiot. I must have looked like one to that sadistic bitch. I went on grabbing at nothing for several hours. It had to be past midnight when I felt something that wasn't natural. I felt a quick brush of a wispy, spiderweb-like form. It was hair. That woman's hair. That thing's hair. I stepped back for a second, looking around in the darkness. I couldn't see her anywhere. I could just barely make out the trees around me. I stood mostly blind, helpless against this monster in the dark. At this point, not being able to see her was worse than actually seeing her. That paranoia that grips you as a little kid in your bedroom, staring at the closet, waiting for the boogeyman to come out and eat you. I finally took a step, not feeling any sign of her anywhere. I kept taking a few very slow steps, trying to make some kind of headway. At this rate, I wasn't sure I would even notice if I was out of the woods or not. I could be standing in a field and I might not really notice. I debunked all of this when I felt the bark of a tree in front of me. I began maneuvering around it, keeping at its base to avoid losing my direction. As I rounded the trunk, I felt something. I felt two icy cold, skeletal hands lightly caressed the sides of my neck. I felt what must have been whatever the fuck that thing was. Its shredded lips lightly kissed my ear. At that moment, I fucking lost it. I turned around, took a swing, hitting nothing, and turned back, taking off running. Kinda funny how quickly I abandoned my plan of just staying slow. I have no idea what the fuck that thing wanted, but it wouldn't be getting it from me. I sprinted through the woods, occasionally bumping into the edge of a tree, heading where I prayed, which was northwest. I was in a full panic, just barely keeping it together enough to remember where I was supposed to be going. It was a flashback to the night before, where I just ran blindly and got myself lost as I was. At least now, I could hope I had stayed in the right direction this time, but I wasn't banking on it. I had to avoid trees in the dark, hoping that lady wasn't behind me or in front of me. But that might be the thing that made me panic the most. The idea that I would just run right into her in the dark and never see her coming. I couldn't shake that feeling. I never felt like she wasn't right next to me. I knew she was always somewhere close by, watching me, waiting for whatever she wanted from me. At some point in the dark, I suddenly ran right into something. It was low and hard. It seemed to be a big rock. I felt one of my shin bones shatter on contact from how hard I was running, combined with the shape of it. I went flying over it, rode over the top of it, and landed in what seemed to be a collection of smaller rocks. I then started groping my way around before finding my footing. The rocks I was standing on were loose, so I ended up falling again. My hand landed just the right way for me to get an idea of the rock itself. It felt so strange. It actually didn't seem like stone. It was too light for that. I picked it up and felt its shape, discovering it to be a bone. I felt around a bit more and found that all of the small rocks I was laying on were actually bones, some of them clearly human. I began trying to crawl my way out before brushing my head on something metallic. I picked it up, finding it to be an old lighter. I gave it a few clicks to see if it worked. I have no idea if it did, since I was terrible with lighters. I never could get one to light up. As I sat there, I felt something brush against my leg. It was a hand. I jumped back, assuming it was her. As I backed away, I heard what I can only describe as a hoarse, weak, wheezing noise. I grabbed a large rock, crawling over it, attempting to rest for energy. I wasn't sure how well I could do with that busted leg bone. As I sat back, I could hear snow crunching from behind me. I listened carefully, trying to see exactly where it was coming from. How close was it? It was in the bone pile, apparently. The footsteps suddenly stopped, as I heard total silence for a few seconds. The wheezing kicked back, more panic sounding this time, like a person who had their vocal cords cut desperately, trying to talk. I suddenly began hearing a different crunching noise. It sounded like bone breaking. It sounded like flesh tearing. I didn't know what was worse, what was happening, or what might be happening, and not knowing was killing me. I had to know what it was. Curiosity was driving me crazy, even though I dreaded what the answer to my question might be. Finally, I decided I had to see. I peeked over the rock, seeing nothing but darkness, of course. But then I remembered the lighter. I gave it a few flicks before finally getting the damn thing to light. When I looked down, I saw her. I now saw the full scope of the bone pile. It was huge. It looked almost like one of those mass graves that genocides and massacres have been known to produce. There were some animal bones too, deer, birds, dogs, but it seemed like it was mostly human bones. As I looked closely, I saw tooth marks on the bones. As I looked up, I saw exactly what she was doing, the exact source of that noise. It was a man. It looked to be a middle-aged man, or at least what was left of him. His body was missing from around his stomach down. She was holding his torso up, devouring him. She was biting off organs and flesh, breaking bone with her teeth, where it had once wore its disguise as a normal woman, attempting to maintain a sort of dignity or beauty. All of it had mostly been abandoned. Its mouth opened too wide, mostly due to what seemed to be her cheeks missing, as she tore off huge chunks of flesh like an animal. She then looked up at me, giving me a frigid look with those eyes. She glared at me, her female dignity returning. She stood, her mouth covered in frozen blood. The man seemed to be fading quickly. His body was blue from frostbite. I have no idea how he was still alive, but he most likely wouldn't be for much longer. As she approached me, she took further notice of the lighter I carried. She seemed to shy away from me when she saw it, like she was afraid of it, but she still approached me, slowly, inching closer. As she approached, I realized what it was. Everything about her was cold. Her body was cold. Her home was cold. Her victims were cold. Her food was cold. So anything with heat must have been something she can't deal with. As she was within arm's reach, I thrust the lighter at her. She quickly backed away before continuing her approach. I tried this a few more times before realizing that I was right. She couldn't stand heat. At this point, I had a crazy idea that I must have gotten from an action movie. I figured that if she was afraid or weakened by heat, I could set her on fire and possibly be done with her for good. As well as I could, I kept the lighter lit up and gently tossed it at her, reaching right into her hair. Her hair, lightly, catching a slight bit of fire before the lighter faded out onto the ground. I couldn't see what was happening, just embers coming from her, apparently burning her hair. I didn't want to stick around. This thing didn't seem to be very mortal, so I didn't want to risk the idea that I had only pissed it off. As best as I could with my busted up leg, I took off running, which actually wasn't very fast, more like limping away, but it was fast enough. I didn't see any really convincing signs that she was following me, but I'll never be sure. Everything after that is just kind of blurry. I have no clue how long I must have been running. It seemed almost like I must have fallen asleep while running, because suddenly I was reaching the highway, staggering out onto the pavement and collapsing. At this point, I blacked out. What happened between then and when I woke up in the hospital was extremely fuzzy. I must have been picked up by somebody at some point, but I don't remember who they were or when they came along. What I do remember was coming to my senses for a few seconds in somebody's car, or it might have been the cab of a truck. The person asked me who I was, and I answered. They asked me what I was doing out in the woods and what happened to me. For all I know, I blacked out again before I could answer. I woke up in the hospital in the afternoon. The doctors and police were asking me what happened to me. I didn't mention the bones, fearing that by doing so, I would end up sending some police officers to their death. I just told them that I had gone for a walk in the woods and became hopelessly lost. One officer asked me about the marks on my body. Apparently, when the woman touched me, she left marks of frostbite on my neck in the shape of skeletal hands. That's when I told them that I had no idea how that came to be. They didn't really seem to press the issue after that. I got home a few days later. I started my job a few days after that. I wasn't really that great in Norwegian, but had a passing knowledge of it. I asked a few coworkers about the woods, about that forest. An older guy told me about the woods being haunted by something, but he didn't really elaborate, and I don't think I really needed him to, since I knew all that I needed to know about it. On some occasions, I feel like I'm still sometimes back there. When I get a sudden chilly draft in my house, and the feeling that I'm being watched. Even in the summer, even after I have moved out the country, which, once again for work, the frostbite she left on my neck left a very visible scar. It still does hurt a little bit, especially on cold, snowy days. I don't recommend ever going there, not even for a second. I don't know what that thing was, where she came from, or if she even survived my attack. I was lucky to have gotten away, because I know that if I hadn't found that lighter, I would most likely have ended up the same as that guy. I do still warn you though, that if you ever do decide to go, I can't promise that you'll do any better than I did. And to all the men out there, if you ever see a naked woman out in the woods, don't ever approach her. As a matter of fact, run. Turn the other way and run opposite of her as fast as you can. So this happened last week. I think I saw a skinwalker or wendigo. I live in southeastern Pennsylvania, and I know some people have seen skinwalkers in midwestern parts of Pennsylvania, but I never heard any stories from this side. I was in the car riding on my way to work, and I always look out the window. By the way, I wasn't the one driving. There are a lot of deer in my area, and I always see them very frequently. Now, there's an area not too far from my university that has some houses around, but there are a lot of wooded sections surrounding the houses. There's an area where a house was torn down, so there's nothing but weeds and overgrown grass there. While looking out the window, I see in that part what looks like a deer, only it looks like it's crouching down like a person does on its knees. Then it looked up, and I saw its face. It looked very distorted, like it was deformed. It even had horns, and its horns weren't even right, if that makes any sense. They seemed like they were just fake, sort of mangled, and it was just staring, not moving, which I have personally seen deer do before, but this thing looked very menacing. Its eyes weren't right. They weren't on the side of its face like they were supposed to be. They were in the front. I think that's what made it so weird looking. They were big dark eyes on the front of the face, What's freaking me out the most is even if skinwalkers or wendigos aren't real, this was a real creature. As we passed it, I didn't take my eyes off of it. Then when I couldn't see it anymore, I just looked ahead. And that's about it. But what's freaking me out the most is, this was a real creature that wasn't a deer or an elk or any other known animal, especially for the area. I have no idea what this creature was, and I hope I never see it again.
I grew up in central British Columbia, up on a mountain several miles from the nearest town, in the middle of nowhere to be exact. I was hiking a mountain when I was 21 years old. It was the middle of winter, and the snow was about 4 feet deep. I was walking along, and I see these big footprints that look like human footprints, but enormous. It almost seemed like they were bear prints, but they were unnaturally elongated and didn't have the normal claw tips. In the heel of one side of the prints were sprinkles of blood. Then I look way down, following the prints where they go, and I see what looks like a tall, hairy dude stepping through the crunchy, deep snow a few hundred feet away. That's when I ended up going the opposite way and just never looked back. To this day, I'm not sure what it was, but from what I remember, it was tall and skinny, looking like a bear walking upright through the snow. It may have been Bigfoot, but who knows?
So I live in Australia, as I'm not really sure where to. If it makes any difference, I was born in the USA and have family there. I moved here when I was a baby. Supposedly, I have Native American bloodline from the Seneca tribe. It's currently autumn, and I live on the outskirts of a major city. This happened today when I went to hang some washing on the line under our carport. We were starting to lose daylight, so I thought I'd quickly pop out and hang up the last of the washing for the day. It was getting darker by the minute. I had just begun hanging clothes when I started to get an uneasy feeling. I'm unsure why. I brushed it off as I was losing daylight quickly. A minute later, I heard a group of kids up the other end of the street screaming, and then silence. Again, I brushed it off as the kids were just being kids and playing with each other. The intensity of unease grew, and I felt like I was being watched. I then heard a low growl, which was unlike anything I ever heard, and the air got colder, and all the crickets and bugs went silent. I moved the clothes rack to outside the carport so I could use what little light there was to hurry this up as much as possible, which hanging and scanning around between picking up the next piece of clothing, I noticed something new. This dense garden that wrapped around our U-shaped drive looked poor, like it had been trampled in a decent section. I then felt like I was really being watched by something, and right before finishing the clothes, the feeling started to ease off a little bit, and it began to warm back up, like it was when I initially came outside. I was raised with big dogs and grew up in the countryside. I heard all kinds of animal sounds, from wild dogs, foxes, fighting possums, and bats, but I had never heard in my life a growl like the one that I heard before, and I don't know how to explain it, but it didn't sound natural. It sounded close to a dog, but something about it was very wrong. Before going outside, my indoor cat desperately wanted to go outside. Once I came inside, she was acting completely different, skulking around and all fur puffed up. She was then following me and my ankles around the house, which actually is not normal for her. We have a lot of bushland surrounding us and live next to a river. I don't fish in that river anymore, as I always felt like someone was around. I also do have other strange experiences, which I might add in a future update. My friend and I were at a party on the Hopi Reservation in Polaca. It was getting late, and we had a pretty good buzz on. Most of the people we knew had already trickled out, so we decided it was a good time as any to leave. We looked around for the friend who was supposed to give us a ride, because we had all come together. We found him in a back bedroom, drunk and passed out, so we had no choice. We're gonna have to walk. The two of us lived on the other side of the gulch. A good 2 miles. Between were nothing but trees, scrubs, bushes, and some hills. We had barely cleared the houses onto the road passing between the wooded area when we got this funny feeling we were being watched. We decided to leave the road and cut through the trees. It wasn't the easiest walk, but it would cut the distance down some. And even though it was pitch black outside, we knew the way pretty well. We had been a good 20 minutes off the road and heading up towards the hills when that same feeling of being watched came upon us again. We both turned around at the same time, but it was so dark we couldn't see anything. But then, my friend Paul swore he heard some kind of cackling or mumbling. I didn't hear anything, except for maybe the wind in the top of the trees at our back. By that time, none of us was gonna admit it. We were feeling a little scared. Without saying a single word, we picked up the pace, moving along pretty good but not running. And that's when I heard it too. But now, it was more like heavy breathing. Paul then grabbed my arm and gave me a tug forward. We took off running straight up the hill, which wasn't that big, but it was still enough of a slope so I wasn't feeling it in my legs. And on top of that, I was drunk. Think about this for a second. Running up a hill, at night, drunk, complete darkness, and as you're running, you hear footsteps behind you, and heavy breathing. Whatever it was though, stayed with us every step of the way. Right at the top, Paul and I stopped and turned around, expecting the thing to be right on us. But we were standing there, huffing and puffing, and looking at nothing but darkness. A few seconds passed, and then we heard a thin laughter, as if it was coming from down the hill and back from where we started running. We decided to keep moving and put some distance between us. We turned to go down the other side of the hill, and there, standing right in front of us, was this creature. It was standing up on 2 legs, like a circus dog, only much taller, with both paws extended out in front of it. It had this coyote face, and it was grinning at us, all of its teeth exposed, and its tongue sliding from one side to the other. I couldn't believe how skinny it was, as if it hadn't eaten in weeks. Its rounded stomach sticking out like one of those African kids in the charity ads, and the skin sinking between its ribs. The smell was unbelievably bad, like the smell of an old, wet dog. We both jumped back with a scream, like 2 little schoolgirls. As we did, the creature dropped down on all 4s and ran past us and down the hill back where we had come from. It was yipping and laughing all the way. Paul and I started praying like never before, swearing to Jesus that if he got us home safe, we would never drink again. The laughing, or whatever you want to call it, died down and disappeared. Wasting no time, the 2 of us made our way down that hill and into the trees that separated us from where we lived. As we walked along, We were trying to convince each other everything was okay. It was only a coyote out searching for a meal. We scared that it jumped up at us and then it ran away. We started feeling better about things overall. We got across the open field and into the trees. We made it all the way through there without anything else happening. However, just as we stepped out towards that first backyard that we needed to cut through to get to the street, we heard this unmistakable chatter, like some little monkey laughing, coming out of the trees just behind us. It was followed by the sound of something moving through the branches and twigs. My friend Paul then yelled out some words that he said that his grandmother had taught him, and just like that, the noise ceased and it got real quiet. He then grabbed my arm again and we ran. We ran as fast as we could through that yard and out to the road. We ran straight for the house where Paul lives with his grandmother. When we got there, we found her awake and sitting in the kitchen with only a small candle for light. She was burning some cedar. When she saw us, she put her finger up to her lips and then pointed to the outside of the house. Her lips were moving, but silently. We stood there still for a minute or two, and then she spoke out loud, saying it was okay. She then said a prayer, and that the skinwalker was now gone. I have no idea how she knew, and I didn't care. Needless to say, I spent the rest of the night there, sleeping where I knew I would be safe. Do you love Native American legends? Have you heard of the Goat Man? No? Then please, allow me to enlighten you. I heard the legend when a power outage on our reservation made us decide to have a fire. As we all know, nothing goes better with a good fire than a good story. That's where I learned about the Goat Man. The legend goes that they shapeshift. They love human forms most of all, which is what makes them so dangerous. It's also said that if you find a bone of one, take a picture and keep it in your house. It will wait. For what though, you may ask? The answer is they wait for you to leave. Once you leave, they ransack the place until they find what you took from them. There was even an incident about that night that I heard of, where some people met the Goat Man face to face. It was a night like the one I was experiencing. Some men had decided to have a fire in the desert, and they told some stories about it. Then a stranger walked out of the desert and took a seat, never speaking a word. No one really got a good look at the stranger. One man brought up the legend of the Goat Man, causing the stranger to listen a little more closely. At the end, the other men nervously laughed, and the stranger stayed silent. The man decided to go back to their homes and put out the fire. They didn't have enough room for the stranger, and they figured he could hitchhike back to town. They had just left when they saw something chasing after their truck. Afraid, they sped up, and the creature sped up its pursuit as well. When it reached the truck, it flipped over and dragged 3 men off into the night. What happened to them? Well, they were never found. So here I am, to warn you, and to be careful of the Goat Man. They can shapeshift, didn't I tell you? That homeless man begging for change that you encounter on your way home tonight could be one, or your boss, teacher, or even your friend. This happened about a week and a half ago. I live in Washington State. I'm a 14-year-old male. I'm homeschooled, so I don't leave the house much, and I live with my mom and my dad. It was March 7, 2022, at about 12 a.m. I was just listening to an old Gen of Marbles and Julian podcast from like 3 years ago and playing some video games. I was kind of tired and I had just finished eating a snack, so I went to go brush my teeth and wash my face. I did all my business in the bathroom and came back to my room. When I opened the door, my cat was up in his cat tower, which is right next to my window, and his back was arched up. His hair on his back was all up, and he was hissing, which I had never heard him do. I look out the window, and standing there is my dad. This gave me a relief for a second, until I realized it wasn't my dad. It was taller than my dad, and its smile was weirdly big. My dad never just smiles at me, and he's never came up to my window before. What the fuck is that? I said as I ran out my room, crying and shaking, obviously, because I never seen anything like that before. I went to my mom, who was sleeping on the couch, and I shook her awake. I told her to go check if my dad was in the bedroom, and she asked why. And I told her I would tell her after she checked, and indeed, he was sleeping in the bedroom. I told her what happened and she sort of believed me, but sort of didn't. So she went into my room and checked out my window. Whatever it was gone. She checked all the other windows and doors, and nothing was there. She even grabbed my cat, and we slept on the couch that night, all together. Today was the first day I was able to go back into my room, March 17th, and I still haven't told my dad about it. I have no idea what it was that I saw, but the only thing I can think of is that it was a skinwalker. Anyway, I don't think I'll ever be able to forget this, and I'm still terrified that I'm gonna end up seeing it again. It's crazy. I looked behind my shoulder like 10 times while writing this. What the fuck? Two years ago, I went to go visit family up in North Minnesota around Labor Day weekend. I won't give the exact location, but will provide at least a general location where this happened. To keep it short, I'm hoping someone may have had similar experience, or may have had a general idea what this thing or entity was walking around our tent. On that Labor Day weekend, my girlfriend and I were planning on spending time camping with her family. Both of us were very excited to get away from the everyday city life, and we anticipated a much-needed low-key weekend. We arrived at their location around noon on Saturday, and were all greeted by everyone there. During the day and evening, we were enjoying ourselves with random fun activities, and catching up on how everyone was doing. As the night started to settle in, we were all near the campfire for a few hours until 11 p.m. Eventually, the family and ourselves called it a night, and we all headed to bed. My girlfriend and I were offered to sleep in a bigger size 6-person tent. It belonged to a relative who I will call Mary. It was a kind gesture at that time, as we only brought a 2-person sized tent. Having that additional space for our belongings and our air mattress was a nice added feature. Mary's tent was positioned not too far from the campfire and the rest of the family. The family did a wonderful job clearing and maintaining the area for their smaller RVs and additional tents. To the back of the tent, about 20 to 30 yards, is where the woods started with semi-thick brush and trees. Us three were laying down chatting, and eventually they both fell asleep. For some reason though, I couldn't sleep, so I was on my phone passing time, hoping to eventually drift off to sleep. This is when I heard a faint noise in the woods about 40 yards back. I dismissed it right away, as deer are known in this area, and I continued to space off on my phone looking at random things. About 10 to 20 minutes later, I heard something get closer to our tent. I could hear twigs snapping and moving between bushes getting closer to our area. This started to get my attention, as I could start physically feeling a faint shake in the ground as this thing was wandering around. Moments later, this thing was about 10 yards away from our area, walking, running back and forth. Whatever this thing was, with each step it took, I could physically feel the vibration from the ground. This thing was big, and the best way to describe this feeling is if you went to a live rock concert and you felt the kick drum hit your body. At this point, I was a bit terrified, as I was trying to follow the footsteps, walking or running at the back and the side of the tent. This thing got at least 5 yards near our area, and then suddenly it stopped where Mary was sleeping at, near her tent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, scared of what this thing was going to do next. I shit you not, a few seconds later, Mary shot up from being dead asleep. She gasped for air and was calling our names to wake us up. You could hear her voice. She was terrified. This thing hightailed off back into the woods. Both of us were very startled at this point. The woods had become dead silent, and eventually we got enough courage to look outside. We saw and heard nothing, and about 30 minutes later, we ran to the shop to grab a shotgun. Another anomaly during this whole thing, while we were alert and awake, Mary mentioned during this time I was awake that she was having a dream. She mentioned these things were tormenting her, saying they wanted her soul and to give it to them. My girlfriend dismissed the whole thing and said it was most likely just a deer, etc., running around. After hearing my girlfriend say that, I never told anyone about this story until recently, as I started to think about it again, trying to figure out what the hell this thing or entity was. My family has lived in Iowa since July of 2017, and we live in a small neighborhood with a minimum of 25 houses, and it is surrounded by a forest. I've seen many horror movies, and most of the movies are always in a forest, so I've been paranoid and been alarmed. Our dog was getting old, so we got another dog, and so now our old dog has a friend. We named our new dog Tucker, and he is a very energetic dog with everyone and everything. Our old dog died a few months later, and Tucker was the only interactive pet we now had. A couple of years later, my mom and dad got divorced, and she moved on to a guy that lives a couple of miles away from our house. My mom and dad settle on a schedule on what day they can spend the day with us, while the other goes somewhere else for a couple of days. For context, my mom's side is native, and we do believe in the lore of skinwalkers and wendigos. On one of my mom's days, she drives up this road where it's surrounded by a bunch of trees and a couple of houses and 2 farms. There is a hill on this road that she has to drive up, and as my mom drove up the hill, she saw something in a field near the neighborhood. What she saw was tall, gray-skinned, had deer hoofs as feet, and it was walking into the woods. My mom was confused, and when she reached the stop sign, she looked back in her mirror, and nothing. Now my mom was scared, because she remembered all the stories of the Wendigo and Skinwalkers, and drove off to our house. When she told me this, I was already scared because of all the stories I had heard on YouTube. As she told the story, I remember the Skinwalker. Mostly, all the stories of the encounters I had found on YouTube. After this, I was extremely cautious when I was outside on my bike rides. Without thinking, I rode my bike near the hill where my mom saw the possible Wendigo. I brought my camera to take pictures of the landscape because it was nice out, but I became paranoid when I came near to the field, and I always trust my paranoia. As I rode off, I felt like I was being watched when I rode past the field. A couple of days later, it was nighttime, and my dog had to go outside to go to the bathroom. I put my dog on a leash that is connected to the porch, and I let Tucker out. I turned on the light that was outside so I could see what Tucker was doing, but I was cooking food in the kitchen for me, so I had to focus on that. When my food was finished, I heard my dog start barking at something, so I walked towards the door so I could see what he was doing. As I approached the door, I can see Tucker is barking at something in the dark. I opened the door more and told Tucker to stop barking and to get inside because his barking could wake up the neighbors. After telling him to get inside, he kept barking at something in the darkness. My paranoia kicked in and I shouted to him to get inside. He kept barking. That's when I started to get scared, and I finally looked into the darkness to see nothing but eyes shining from the porch light. As I saw those eyes, my instincts kicked in to pull on the leash and scream out, "Get inside!" Finally, Tucker responds by reacting to the pull and running towards the door, and I slammed the door as soon as Tucker ran inside. I shut the porch light off and took the leash off his collar. I locked every single door and window in the house and covered every window and anything that you can look through. After Tucker was off the leash, he ran downstairs into our basement. So I grabbed my food and went downstairs to keep an eye on my dog. It's been 2 months since then, and my routine when it got dark was what I did when I saw those eyes outside. Close the blinds, lock the doors, and turn off the lights from outside. Now, whenever I'm outside, I'm always with a group of people, or I always keep a weapon on me. Skinwalkers. Yeah, I grew up on the reservation, and we just follow little rules at night to keep ourselves safe. They are real, 100%. My entire family has seen them. I have many native friends who have family members that are actually part of the Skinwalker community. I mean, I don't know how else to phrase it. Some of these rules are no whistling at night, don't say the name out loud, don't leave windows open on a full moon. One time we had one claw and cry at the side of our house on a full moon, so this is a personal rule that not many other people follow. We also have restricted places we can't go at night because they are Navajo worshiping grounds. And for anybody who isn't Navajo, there are places you cannot visit legally because of Skinwalkers, religious practices, and sacred land masses. I do want to point out that, as a side note, most of the time they just look like normal people. They're not what the media makes them out to be. There are some non-native families living in our small town, and Skinwalkers are just a normal part of their life. My mother actually cared for one in the nursing home who didn't fully transition, and there were rules that she had to follow. Some of them are smearing ash on their foreheads before entering the Skinwalker's room, saying a Navajo sacred prayer, and never entering alone. There's also a few wild stories from her experience when it comes to physically caring for one, but it may be too long to add here. Now, most of them look like humans, but when it's not, it's a funky long creature that can take the form of anything with one abnormal thing attached to it, like a goat with 7 legs or a dog without a nose. They want that flesh of yours. So here are more extra tips to survive them. Living in the reservation is like playing a game of what the hell was that noise every night. If someone begins to smell like their flesh is rotting, run. If someone wants to take you to the reservation, politely say no and just move to another city. Don't ever come back, and pray. Pray to whoever you believe in. If you're not religious, pray to a random god, to anybody that comes to mind. Skinwalkers are demonic creatures. But if you're ever in the woods and you hear some whistling, this is a calling sign that the Skinwalker is coming after you.
This is something that happened to me about 2 years ago at my friend's house. She lived right across a fairly busy 2-lane road from the parking lot of our college campus. The other 5 people in the house were asleep, and it was about 3:30 in the morning. I went outside to smoke a cigarette because I couldn't sleep. I'm sitting on the front swing, and I hear some rustling. I figured it was any type of animal and ignored it. But then, I heard what sounded like something on 2 legs shuffle through the leaves on the sidewalk at a very fast pace. I became alert. I stand up, still smoking my cigarette, and look over at the right side of the property with the tiny evergreen bushes. Now, the parking lot is across the street. The lights are on at all hours, so it actually illuminates from behind, leaving me to only see silhouettes. I see something that may have been about 4 feet tall. It looked like it would be a little shorter than my chest height, and it was peeking out, looking at me, like it was curious. But I also felt like it was malicious, because I got this overwhelming sense of dread and fear. We stared at each other for what felt like 3 solid minutes. It almost felt like I was in a trance. The best way to describe the thing I saw would be like it was proportioned, but malnourished. Someone once suggested that it might be a little person, but I know for a fact it was not. This thing was very thin and perfectly proportioned, like a thin and sick child. I guess it kind of looked like that little guy from the Lord of the Rings movies. I looked down at my cigarette for more than a second, and when I looked back up, it was gone. I heard more movement, and that's when I said fuck this, and ran inside and locked the door behind me. Then, sitting on the couch, I was staring at the window when I suddenly saw something run across, blocking a portion of the light from the parking lot as it went by. For it to do this, it had to have been on the porch, where I was just outside.
When I went to Mexico with my dad in the mid-80s, they lived in a rancho, and my dad told me to go to bed once because after midnight, some of the animals that have been cursed by witches start to talk, and they will come around looking for anyone who will talk with them. So if you live in a rancho, in a farm, or own livestock or animals of any kind, be careful if you hear them talking to you tonight.
I live on a farm out in the middle of nowhere that raises sheep and goats. I get up every morning around 7 a.m. to go feed them. But something strange happened this morning. I went down to the fence, and I saw something strange at the far end of the sheep pen. At first, I thought a sheep was hanging from the fence post, but as I got closer, I realized that the sheep was standing on its hind legs. The realization made me freeze in my tracks about 10 feet away from the animal. I just stood there in silence for a moment, and after maybe 30 seconds of standing still, the sheep turned around and looked at me. It didn't even seem fazed that I was watching it. And then, the scariest thing I ever experienced in my whole life. It said, "Good morning." And then it dropped back onto all fours and went to eat with the rest of the sheep. The voice, however, was definitely a man's voice, but it sounded off, like a man who had just been roundhouse kicked in the throat. I have no clue what happened here. I don't live anywhere near Skinwalker territory, so that's out of the question. And it wasn't malicious in any way. If anything, it was actually quite polite. As insane as that sounds, is there even such a thing as a harmless skinwalker? I know I wasn't seeing things, but I just don't have a clue what it could have been. Has anybody ever experienced something like this before? I have heard stories of how animals, especially goats, speak at night.
I was camping in the middle of nowhere in Washington. Not like an official campground, just way out in the forest where I wouldn't have expected another human for miles. One night, I wake up and hear something. I open my tent, and there is a guy sitting by where my fire had been right outside my tent. Nothing strange about the guy, just a normal looking dude, sitting there a couple feet from my tent. No backpack or anything with him, just a guy. He saw me open the tent, and his eyes got big, like he had just seen a ghost, and he took off. It shook me up pretty badly, but over the next day, I was able to put it out of my mind. After writing it off as just some strange occurrence, and a guy that was maybe high or something, and had somehow managed to set up a camp not far from mine. Then, 2 days after that, and 10 to 15 miles away in a totally different direction that nobody could take the same path as on accident, I was sitting by the fire that night, and I started to hear noises that I got more and more convinced were a person. I called out to them, and out of the darkness someone was like, "Yo, do you know how to get to Bell's Canyon?" I said no, I don't even think that's a real place there. They kept talking from just out of my line of vision. I tried to see them with my flashlight, aimed that way, and sounded kinda scared and not wanting to piss off a potentially crazy person. I pointed the flashlight somewhere else. After like 15 minutes of being freaked out, and this person just talking and asking completely random questions, from the darkness, it sounded like the voice had gotten closer. So I ended up shining my light that way again. And it was the same dude who had been outside my tent 2 nights before. He must have followed me about 15 miles over 2 days, because there is no way he could have ended up in the same spot as me, as big as that wilderness is. No possible way. As soon as I shined my light on him, he took off again. I started to chase him but didn't want to get lost in the wilderness in the dark, so I stopped quickly after about 100-200 feet. This one couldn't be written off, because the only way he could have been in both places is if he was following me. I decided that the trip was over first thing in the morning, and ended up hiking back out over 3 days, always doubling back, trying to throw anyone following off my trail, and sometimes hiding and waiting to see if he would come by following me. I really can't describe how terrifying it was. to feel like I was being hunted through the woods, and to actually have to brainstorm on things I could do to best avoid ending up being killed. On the first night of hiking out, twice I heard what sounded like a person walking circles outside my tent, but by the time I got the courage to look out, nobody was there. On the second night, I heard what I thought was an animal making noises at first in the distance, but I slowly decided that it sounded more like a human making animal calls. But it also could have been an actual animal, but I didn't actually see the guy again, but it really sounded like a person making noises. I basically cried when I finally got back to my vehicle. The relief was so strong. To this day, this was the most terrifying experience I ever had. I have no idea who the guy was or what his intentions were, but I just can't really articulate just what a terrifying few days it was. The whole situation was pretty intense, especially given that it went on for a few days. Like, imagine the feeling of noticing that there is someone following you in a dark alley. Then stretch this out into 3 days and make it to where you have to sleep in the alley, and that's exactly what this experience was like. The feeling wasn't of being scared, but it was this constant knot in my stomach that someone out there was hunting me for 3 days. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage. Joe lived on a farm that was next to a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning, and we would stay in the woods all weekend. We would only come out for school. We would be out there building shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we would walk the railroad tracks out into the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we would find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we would likely be trespassing. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers. We discovered bridges no one went to. We fished. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was the best. In fact, it was so fun we did it a bunch of times and never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own separate ways. We both ended up leaving home, but we always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits, so we would see each other often. Well, one summer, in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We would do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we would catch drinks at the bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the good old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Remembering these moments and drinking beer are a hell of a mix. Soon, we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. When the day finally came, we started early in the morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot, where we used to always start, right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe said that instead of walking the usual way, we should take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well. We had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we went. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked the joint and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and more stuff. Before the night arrived, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forest area, trees on every side of the train tracks so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We also brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the area. Now, this is also something we used to do in the old days as well. We would walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods, and we also went up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we would be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom. About 100 yards into the woods, it was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something, because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were standing, everything was quiet. No movement. Nothing could be seen. No lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of rot. A cross still stood on top of the place. None of the windows had glass and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside, and there were rows and a section up in the front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else, no footprints, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We quickly left and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on early morning. When the night came, we were laying down, and we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree. It was near pitch black, and we didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't even speak. When we got to the top, we saw a light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a conversation that boiled down to this. Can you believe this shit? The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and even though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in a different language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was there, but we only saw shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had a lot of space between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language, because we couldn't even understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained crying that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then, it finally stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here, man," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out the doorway, all holding hands in a single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move towards us and the hill. That's when we booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving weird, like whoever was holding them was also shaking them. We continued to run and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes down, and we walked there. Got to a 24-hour gas station and called my wife to come get us. My wife and all her other friends just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that has ever happened out in the woods. I wasn't sure where else to post these stories, so I figured I'll share them here. I've been a search and rescue officer for a few years now, and along the way, I've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff and can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old "stay where you are" thing, and they don't wander far off. But I had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both of these cases bothered me a lot, and I used them as motivation to search even more on the missing person cases I get called on. The first was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time, both the kids apparently wandered off. When their parents couldn't find them, they called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he had been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, and that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. The last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched the area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. According to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she had never came back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours calling her name before they decided to call for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone, because nobody, including her mother or grandpa, saw her come down from the tree. A few times, I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and he tried to lead me straight up cliffs, not hills, not even rocky faces, straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling, and in those cases, we sometimes find the person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine had led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but everything's so strange out here. One specific sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl had fell down and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance and let out the most haunting, heartbroken cry I ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. I heard from another search and rescue officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. Apparently, she couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another search and rescue officer because we received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he was. We found him trapped with a broken leg. It wasn't pleasant. He had been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper, and I heard from one of the EMT guys that the man was saying strange things. He kept talking about how he had been doing fine, and when he got to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment and that he was wearing ski pants. He said he walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said that the man had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he had fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible, muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm actually glad I wasn't there to hear him say it. But can you imagine being trapped with a broken leg and hearing a faceless man running up and down beside you, screaming all night? I once led a trip to the top of Mount Sterling in North Carolina. It's a tough climb to get to the top, and about 6 miles from the nearest road. I was leading a group of 8 middle school kids and 1 co-instructor. We were camping out on top of the mountain, and it was a beautiful night with a full moon. The kids and the other co-instructor went to bed in their tents. I chose to spend the night in a hammock that night. I was really into a book I was reading, so I stayed up and read until about 10:30 p.m. I turned my headlamp off to settle in for the night. Everything around me was rather bright from the moon and from the position I was in. I could see down the trail we had hiked to get to the top. I lay there enjoying the scenery and noticed something moving along the trail. Bears are common in the area, so I perked up. As it got closer, I could tell it was a person. We were in the middle of nowhere, and there was someone hiking up the trail with no headlamp or any gear. I was just frozen, watching this person move closer to our camp. They arrived at the top of the mountain where we were and just stopped. I watched as what appeared to be a man surveyed our camp. I really could only see the outline of him. He stood there for what seemed like 30 minutes, but may have been 10. He then turned and sat down under a tree, facing our camp. He was sitting up in a way that I knew he wasn't trying to sleep. He just sat there, staring at our camp. I had no idea what to do, so I decided to wait it out. And I waited, just staring at the man, while he stared at my camp. This went on until about 3:30 a.m. Then he stood up, took a moment to survey my camp a few minutes longer, and then went back down the trail he came up on. I, to this day, have no idea what that was all about, but it freaked me out. I was paranoid that we were being followed for the rest of the trip. There was a group of teens that hadn't been heard from after their scheduled return time from a camping trip. A coworker and I head out into the general direction the teens had set off in. We had been hiking for most of the day and seen nothing. We're about 35 kilometers into the woods at this point when we start noticing strange things. Sticks carved like spears stuck into the ground, weird carvings in the trees, a child stuffed animal hanging from a noose up in a tree. This place was nowhere near any roads. It wasn't on the regular trails people would go on in the area. The really eerie thing was that everything was freshly carved. Somebody had been there within a couple of hours of us and made these things. Mind you, we're still looking for those teens. We kept on hiking and eventually made camp for the night. Still kind of on edge from what we had seen earlier, but we settled down anyway and go to sleep. We get up with the sunrise, hoping to cover more ground before it gets too hot. We pack up the gear and get ready to go when I noticed a bit of a shirt that had caught on a small tree and ripped along with some shoe prints. We were thinking, great, maybe we're close by the teens, when a radio call comes through. The teens had just been found 20 kilometers east of us, and now they're calling everybody back. All those weird things we had seen from the day before came flooding back into my mind, and we wasted no time hiking out of those woods. I'm a ranger at Yellowstone. A couple of weeks ago, I was exploring the Lamar Valley, about 11 miles from the nearest road, and even further to the park. There, in the middle of the trail, is a perfectly severed deer head. No blood, nothing, no ragness at the severed head, perfectly intact. This is weird because I've seen many wolf and bear spoils, and I used to find cougar prey remains in South Dakota with radio tracking just after the cougar made them. This was not any of those things. This head was completely uneaten. Eyes, tongue, everything was still intact. Even the ravens hadn't touched it yet. Right smack in the middle of the trail. And again, no blood. Even a human doing it made no conventional sense. It was a doe, so it had no antlers. Plus, why leave it in the trail? The whole thing, even in broad daylight, gave me chills. Just an ocean of waving grass, bison calmly grazing, and a perfectly clean deer head right on the middle of the path. Our park lets kids from school in so they can look for animals in the forest and the streams. One day, a kid finds molars. The teeth look like they belong to a human, but the teacher said they were a deer's. I dismissed it and completely forgot about it. 2 days later, they found the body with a smashed skull and jaw in another part of the park. All its teeth were missing. A local newspaper covered it, but all they had to say was thank the spooky skeletons for good bones and teeth. I found a deceased man in a tree. I am a seasonal ranger for my local forest district. The rest of the rangers say we found about one self-harm victim a year. So here was the one for this year. When we go around opening parks each day, we drive through to make sure everything is okay. In this instance, I was driving through and had just lost sight of the road when I saw a man hanging from a tree in a clearing. He had hung himself. I called the cops. The medical examiner took an hour to show up, and he was the only one with a ladder long enough to cut the guy down. So basically, I stared at a dead body in a tree for an hour. I was surveying a remote restoration site near an old trail, and I heard someone walking up a nearby road. All the hair on the back of my neck stood up, so I grabbed all my stuff and started casually walking down the trail like I belonged there. I turned the corner and there was a shirtless guy swinging a crowbar around in circles, and when he saw me, he started yelling, "I got a crowbar, I got a crowbar." I think I nodded at him, squeaked something like, "Nice crowbar," and then I ran the mile or so back to my truck. A shed behind an abandoned house with a steel reinforced door broken off the hinges. The windows of the shed were boarded up from the outside. The only thing inside the shed was a queen-size bed with shredded white sheets. I'll never forget that night. I am a park ranger, and that is all you will learn about me, aside from this story. During the summer of 2008, I had been assigned to a watchtower in the middle of a heavily forest area. Most nights, it was uneventful, and I tended to just read a book as I waited for my shift to end. However, this night, when I started my shift, the guy I took over from was shaken up. Concerned, I asked what was wrong. All he did was shake his head and said, "There are things in the woods." He didn't say anything else and just left me standing there like a jackass jerk. Well, I set up for the night and took out my book. It was The Mailman, and I found myself surprised by how much I enjoyed it. Sometime around an hour into my shift, something struck the window. I jumped up and quickly sat the book down. Before checking it out, I had expected it was either a big bug or some poor bird. It was a bird alright, but not what I had been expecting at all. This bird was dead long before it had collided with the window, both wings torn right off and stripped of all feathers. It was bound together with straps made from long grass blades. This was the clear evidence that this was man-made. I quickly took out my flashlight and began scanning the area beneath me. I couldn't see much through the woods. However, as I did a quick double take, I swear I saw a dark shape dart away from the light. I feel this needs some elaborating. I could barely make out anything, but when I brought my light over this thing, I only got a brief glimpse I literally couldn't describe it for the life of me. This thing was fast. Too fast. Alright, listen up, you punks. If you're out there, show yourself right now. I used my most commanding voice possible. Nothing. As I drew my pistol, I heard the radio crackle. Naturally, I went to check and picked up the receiver. As I held it up to my ear, I could only hear static, so I at first assumed it was a glitch. But right as I decided to set it down, something stopped me. Call it intuition, something just wasn't right. And then I realized what it was. I could hear something over the radio. It was faint, so I really had to strain to hear it. Slowly, I could make out what sounded like faint, low humming. There was a pattern to it. A steady beat that started low, building up, then carefully dropped back down in an instant. I don't know how long I was listening to that humming sound, but eventually I turned off the radio, ready to radio it in. Then I realized I could still hear the humming. Without a second thought, I drew my pistol and turned around on my heel before steadily walking back outside. That humming sound sounded like it was all around me, following that same pattern. I still had to strain to make it out, but there was no question it was there. I swiveled around, pistol aimed at empty air. Every part of me was screaming to call for backup, but I wasn't sure what I needed backup for. I needed some proof of what I was dealing with, so I waited, on guard and ready, and then it stopped. As I became accustomed to the silence, I couldn't hear anything, not even a bug chirping. Cautiously turning my flashlight back on, I pointed it down at the base of the tower. Nothing whatsoever. Then I heard a creak. I immediately spun around, processing this information. At first, I dismissed it as the wood, but then there was another creak, and another. Something was up here with me. It took me a few moments to realize that it was just around the corner. In that moment, fight or flight kicked in full gear, and I chose fight. I rounded the corner and found nothing, absolutely nothing. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I was nervous, but I still had a job to do, and with no other option, I decided to call for backup, which I should have done that a long time ago. I realized that when I saw the receiver had been cut right off, I stared, dumbfounded by a few moments before grabbing my walkie-talkie instead. But when I turned it on, all I got was a harsh whine right in my ear, which caused me to drop it as I recovered. Once I had, I immediately tried to find it, but it was gone. My situation was desperate. I was now completely cut off with some thing or other that seemed to defy all sense. If I was going to make it out of this, I had to stay put and wait for someone to come check on me. I still had my pistol drawn, waiting and waiting. I then quickly shined my flashlight outside one last time, and this time, I finally saw them, standing among the trees, staring up at me. They had been avoiding me all this time, so to see so many of them, you might be wondering what they were. And I'd rather not tell you, for my sake. I was at my limit then, and screamed, turning off my flashlight and pointing my gun right at the door. There, I stayed for the rest of my shift, unwilling to move from that spot. I consider it a miracle I lasted for the rest of my shift. By the time someone finally arrived to see why I wasn't checking in, I poured out every single thing I had gone through. At first, the other ranger looked at me like I was crazy, but when he asked if I had any proof, something landed on the roof of his vehicle. It was another dead, naked, and wingless bird wrapped in grass. Needless to say, we booked it right out of there. When I got back and made a report about what happened, I demanded to speak with the last guy who had been on the previous shift. I really wanted him to have it for not warning me of what was out there. But here's the thing, we never found him. We searched high and low, checked every single record for a trace. We tried to look up his name when we could remember it, but it seemed like he never existed in the first place. So, what the hell took his shift? I try to live my life without too many regrets. I had highs and lows like everyone else in life, sure, but I do what I can to not worry too much about what could have happened if I made a different choice, if I maybe hadn't taken the road less traveled. Everyone makes the best decisions they can with the information they have available to them at the time. Going through all the what ifs is crazy, because the only way you would have made a different choice is if you had some other detail, which of course you didn't. You can never be exactly sure what the sequence of events might have looked like if you gone right instead of left. And yet, there is one choice I made, one road that I took, that I just can't help but wonder how things might have turned out if I had only done something different. My job has me move around pretty often. I'm not going to get into what I do. That has no bearing on the story. But a couple of years ago, I was working in Philadelphia and living on the other side of the Delaware River in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I'm originally from northwestern Pennsylvania, and this was the closest I had been to home since I moved out of college. So I took the chance to go see my parents whenever I could. I knew I would be moving again before long, and my folks aren't getting any younger. So I try to find a weekend every month or so to make the 7-hour trip to visit them. If I had been thinking about it when I was looking for places to rent, maybe I would have tried to live on the west side of Philadelphia instead of this side in Jersey to avoid the rush hour. But by the time I realized, the lease was signed and there wasn't much I could do. The drive to my hometown was pretty boring. I would take the Ben Franklin Bridge across the river, head up I-476 for an hour or so, then a long slog across basically the entire expanse of Pennsylvania on I-80 before another hour north of I-79. The only thing about the drive was how long it would take me to get through Philly, because once I got on the 476 extension, I could predict my ETA within 5 or 10 minutes. My second summer in Jersey, I had taken 2 weeks off and planned on spending the second week back home. Things changed that first Wednesday though, because a big storm came by and knocked out power in a good part of the area where I was living. Dealing with 90-degree heat with no AC wasn't something I felt like spending the first half of my vacay doing. So after one uncomfortable sweaty night, I let my parents know that I was heading over a few days earlier. I should have left first thing in the morning, but because I had a couple of things to take care of before heading out, by the time I finally got on the road that Thursday, it was past lunchtime and getting on mid-afternoon. For whatever reason, the traffic in Philly was heavy, and by the time I finally got through town, I was a good hour behind schedule. Still, based on my timeline, I figure I'll still be able to make it early enough to grab a dinner and beer with my dad and brother before cashing in for the night. There were two things I hadn't taken into consideration. One was the number of other folks that, apparently, had the same idea to get out of town that I did, and that the road construction must have sprung up in the time since my last trip home. The interstate highway system is a heck of a thing. Being able to zip along at 65, 70, or in some remote places like West Texas even faster than that, makes cross-country travel take a fraction of the hours it would otherwise. I can't tell you the number of times my folks always talk about the days before the interstate, when going to see friends outside of DC would take almost twice as long as it does now. What's truly remarkable to me, though, is that even though the entire system of highways was built start to finish in a mere 35 years, it sure seems like when parts of it go under construction, they stay that way forever. Traffic was heavy, but moving, and I was making decent time until I saw the first orange warning signs, letting me know that 4 lanes were reducing to 3, and then 2, and then 1. There were hundreds of cones stretched down the road as far as the eye could see, and see I could as the cars in front of me reached a complete and total standstill. It was one of the worst deadlocks I had ever been in. Seriously, I think I moved about a mile in about an hour. After about 3 hours, my stomach started grumbling. With an exit just ahead and no end to the traffic jam in sight, I got off and found a diner to grab some dinner. Even if traffic picked up, I still had a solid 5 hours of driving ahead of me. So at that point, I knew for sure it was going to be pretty late that I was getting in. After finishing eating, I got back on the road. Things looked like they were picking up for a couple of miles. But then, I came up to the back end of a jam and was right back to waiting. We were moving a little bit better, I think averaging about 5 miles an hour at this point. But as the sun started edging towards the horizon, I pulled out my phone and started to see if Google could point me in any kind of workaround. It's a funny thing about human nature. Most of us don't like to sit still. Studies at airports show that people would rather walk further to baggage claim to get their luggage, even if the total time would have been less if they had a slightly longer wait at plainside. Well, the power of the internet appeared to be in my favor. Even though I-80 still showed the dark red band for another 50 miles or so, there was a southbound country road coming up a few miles, and a northbound a couple after that. Both of these roads looked like they let me bypass the worst of the traffic. Since I spent the better part of the day sitting on the road, my patience was about worn out, and I opted to take the southbound road. Even though the app told me it would take about 30 minutes longer to get to my parents' house, I just wanted to get moving again, and reasoned that at this rate, it might take me more than a 35-minute difference to get to the northbound. And that is a choice that I will remember until the day I die. I made the turnoff and felt my mood improve. The signs changed, limiting my speed between 35 and 40 miles an hour. But even that seemed like flying compared to the logjam I spent the last several hours in. The drive was interesting. The road was starting to get a little twisty, with plenty of changes, as it curved up and around the hills of central Pennsylvania. It took me on a general southwest road, but turned and doubled back on itself enough that for the first 30 minutes or so, I had views of the stalled traffic on I-80. Pretty soon after that though, just about the time that the sun was just dipping down beneath a couple of hills in my rear view mirror, the road took a long curve and carried me down and away out of sight of the interstate. Now, something that a lot of people don't know is how big of a state Pennsylvania is. There are plenty of bigger ones, but Pennsylvania is really big, and it's also remote, isolated. The translation of the name means Penn's Woods. After all, the Blair Witch Project didn't have to embellish that aspect of the state. The fact that you could head into the woods and walk for dozens of miles in any way without seeing anything like another human being was pretty creepy. It's got a decent number of big cities. Pittsburgh and Philly both have enough of a population to support major sports teams. But away from those centers of development, there's a whole lot of nothing. And trees. And dark. And lonely. Roads. Such was the road I was traveling that night. Winding through the twists and turns of the Appalachian foothills. I moved around a lot. I mentioned I traveled through most of the states anyways. I sometimes used to wonder, when I would be driving along a patch of asphalt, surrounded by only untamed wilderness, what it must have been like to build such a road. What was it like before man had intruded with our civilization and our machines? What used to live there? But I don't wonder anymore. Not ever since that night, when I made a left instead of right. The road continued to twist back and forth, up and down. As I went deeper into the foothills, the trees grew thicker, branches from either side of the road reaching over and almost touching, forming a natural canopy 20 feet up that blocked out much of my view of the sky and the stars above. I drove with my high beams on, because the idea of streetlights had never entered the minds of whoever built this road. The painted lines were old and not well cared for. I'd never been a good navigator. My parents used to say it was because, when I was a kid, my nose was always pushed into a book during car rides. But I think it's because I'm just bad at it. So it was that. There was no way possible I could be lost, as there were no other roads that I could have possibly turned onto and gotten off track. I also found myself more frequently checking my phone to ensure I was still on the right path, which is how I almost ran into the other car. My mind was wandering, thinking about the fact that my signal bars had dropped and remained at zero for the last 20 minutes, and what possible implications that would mean if I came across some kind of emergency. I raised my eyes back to the road after Google Maps confirmed for the 20th time that I was still on the right path. That's when my brain took a beat to process that I was approaching a vehicle stopped in the middle of the lane. I slammed my foot on the brake. I stopped in time, but not by much, with maybe 5 feet separating my hood from the other car's rear bumper. My heart was pounding in my chest as adrenaline coursed through my body, but my fear quickly gave way to anger. Seriously, what the hell was this guy doing? Not only was he stopped in the middle of the road, but all his lights were off. If I didn't have my high beams on, there was a good chance I wouldn't have seen him, even if I wasn't checking my phone. I could feel my heart beating in the vein on the side of my neck. I'm not somebody who struggles with road rage, and after a couple of quick seconds, I managed to get a hold of myself, not wanting to outright alarm anyone that might still be in the vehicle. I shifted into reverse and backed up about 20 feet, popping my emergency lights on. That's when I started noticing a few strange things about the stopped vehicle, more than just the fact that the lights were out. Of course, it was stopped in the middle of the road, but that wasn't unreasonable, since there wasn't any shoulder that the driver could have moved onto. The strange thing, though, was that the doors were open, those on the driver's side crossing over slightly onto the other lane. And even more was that I saw that an item was dropped out onto the road by the rear driver's side door, something that appeared to be a child's stuffed animal. I considered my options, and after a few seconds, decided that I would have to go against my better judgment to just keep on my merry way and head outside to get a better idea of what was going on. I said earlier my job doesn't have anything to do with the story, which is mostly true. But before you judge my choices, it bears mentioning that I spent some time in the military. An obligation to help people has been drilled into me over the years, and I've seen enough things while deployed to feel I could handle myself. And so I got out of my car but kept it running. I popped the trunk to grab the flashlight I keep there and left my headlights on so I could see what I was doing. I looked up and down the road, hoping to see signs of other cars approaching, but no luck. I called up to the other car as I cautiously started my approach, circling around to the left, to the middle of the road so I'll be able to get a look inside before I got too close. Anyone there? No answer. My headlights were helping, but there were enough shadows to still hide the car's interior. Shining my flashlight, though, easily determined that no one was inside. I moved closer, stopping down by the rear door to pick up the falling object off the ground. It was a child's toy, just like I thought, a stuffed rabbit, with patches showing signs of frequent love. I frowned. If the folks traveling in the car had hitched the ride with somebody passing by, they would have taken the rabbit, or the kid would have been throwing a fit. I shut the rear door and moved up to the front. I put my hand on the hood and found it was still warm to the touch. That means it couldn't have been here too long. I slid into the driver's seat to try and figure out if there was some kind of mechanical issue that would have forced the car to stop, and was startled to find a set of keys still dangling from the ignition. Pressing the brake, I turned the key and the engine started right up. Headlights and the interior light in the roof springing to life. Fuel, oil, temperature, battery, all the gauges looked good. Not even a check engine light. Strange. Very strange. Then I saw the purse in the passenger seat. I picked it up, a normal brown shoulder bag, and briefly rummaged around before finding a wallet inside. Everything appeared to be intact. About $40 in cash, a couple credit cards, gym membership, Sam's Club card, the driver's license named the owner as Mary Walker, a pretty blonde that had just turned 30 the month before. There were a few pictures showing Mary in stage poses, sitting on a blanket under a tree. A huge, bearded lumberjack of a man hugged her from behind. A small ponytail girl with a goofy over-exaggerated smile on her lap. That's when I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. A shiver running down to the base of my spine. Something was very wrong with this situation. I put everything back in the purse and returned it to the seat. I turned off the car and got out, shutting the driver's door behind me. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and dialed 911, holding it over my head to try to get a connection with no luck. Cursing softly, I jammed the red end call button and moved around to the passenger side of the car. I played my flashlight around and noticed that some of the foliage at the edge of the road was bent and trampled, like someone had walked through it. I didn't have enough woodcraft to be able to judge how long ago they might have passed, but even then, I couldn't imagine any scenario for why they would have gone wandering away. Shining my light into the woods, the beam only extended maybe 30 feet through the trees before being effectively swallowed by the greedy blackness. Looking at all the flat grass, at the stuffed rabbit in my hand, then at the dark trees crowding maliciously, my thoughts came back and forth between what I should do. I made up my mind. I had been trained to help people. It was hardwired into my system. There was a child somewhere in the woods. I raised my foot to take a step onto the path, and that's when a white flicker of movement entered the very edge of my flashlight beam. It was Mary Walker. She was naked and walking stiffly, unnaturally, her arms swaying out of sync with the rest of her body, like a puppet being manipulated by somebody who's not an experienced puppeteer. "Hello?" her voice called out. "Anyone there?" That's when more shapes came into view behind her, shambling along. Here, the bearded man who must have been Mary's husband, then their little girl, owner of the well-loved rabbit, both moving as strange as their wife and mother. And now I could tell there were more, many more, their forms out of the direct light, but so many they caused the darkness to pitch and swell with their strange, staggering passage. Their voices a chorus. Hello? Hello? They called, anyone there? Echoing back the questions I was asking only a few short minutes ago when I approached the abandoned car. I took a stumbling step back, away from the woods and the approaching figures. I ended up tripping onto the walker's car, but at that moment, I shone my light up into the pitch recess of the branches, and in doing so, I could just make out, barely, a sort of darkness figure that was crouched, hidden in the upper limits, a void even darker than the trees. Was it my imagination? Those lines of pure blackness that extended from that concealed mass that seemed to pierce the flesh of Mary Walker and her kin, and the countless other shapes moving in sync with them. That's when I sprinted back to my vehicle, engine still running. Hello? I shifted to reverse, keeping enough of my head to avoid running off the road as I completed a 3-point turn. Anyone there? I took a glance in my rearview mirror. The pale form of Mary Walker stood still just at the edge of the forest where the trees met the road. One hand was raised, signaling me to return, or perhaps waving goodbye. Her face was a mask of confused sadness. I pressed the gas and drove back the way I came. I didn't look back again. The rest of the trip was a fog. At some point after I made it back to the interstate, I called my parents. I let them know that I wouldn't be getting in until late. I drove on autopilot, the traffic jam having cleared while I was off. I thought about calling 911, but I didn't. What would I tell them, and to what end? There was no one left to be helped. I try not to go through life with too many regrets, wondering about what if. But this one, this choice, what if I had left earlier in the day? What if I hadn't stopped for dinner? Maybe I would have still gone left. Maybe I would have been there in time to help the walkers. Maybe I would have been taken by that black thing that was fishing in the darkness. What if I had gone right? Would I still be ignorant, going through life, unknowing that there are these things out there? I try not to think of it too often, but every now and then, all these thoughts turn to the stuffed rabbit. It wasn't until I reached my parents' house that night that I realized I still had that rabbit clutched in my hand. I used to wonder, before man brought our roads and civilization, what was the wilderness like? What lived there? But I don't think about these things no more. I can't afford to. At least, if I don't want to wake up screaming. There are things out there in the woods, in the darkness, in places that humans still have not ventured out to. So be careful when you're out traveling, going into these country roads, and that no matter how bad the traffic is, always stick to the interstate. This is 100% real. I'm from Abilene, Texas, just under 200 miles west of Dallas. I'm 25, and my older cousin I'm going to mention is 30. We have family in San Antonio that we visit every year in the summer. And when I say I mean my grandmother and her daughters, my mom being one of them, and the rest of her sisters, and all their kids, my dad and my sister, my wife and kid, etc. We have a pretty big family, so we make a vacation out of it. We enjoy the water parks and have barbecue and things of that sort. So basically, to not make this too long, some of us took off to San Antonio around lunchtime, one Friday, the weekend of our vacation. Now typically, it's about a 3.5 hour drive if I'm in no rush, and even 4 hour trip. Some of the family left around noon and made it by 4. But me and my cousin, his name is, well, we'll call him Steven. Me and Steven couldn't leave till we got off work Friday around 5:30 to 6. So we left around the same time, which was 7:30. We didn't plan that. He has his own family and I have mine. We also both had one kid at the time and are both still married. So we hit the road, and 1/3 of the way there, in Brady, Texas, we noticed each other at the gas station. What are the odds, right? So we were laughing, and he took off as I went inside and told him I wanted 20 on number 3. I always like to have more than enough fuel on road trips. So after I filled up and checked the baby and wife and make sure that everything is good, we get back on the road. The sun has faded away and it's almost pitch black now. If anyone has driven 283 south, it turns into US 87 just after Mason, Texas, all the way to Fredericksburg, Texas. And basically, the only light for that 1.5 hour strip is your headlight, and that's where it happened. So we're cruising, and there's deer signs every 10 miles or so, because there's so many of them on that strip. So with my aftermarket headlights on my 2013 GMC Sierra, it's very well lit, so I feel comfortable knowing that I'm driving safe in case I see something run out from the side of the road. And just after Mason is when I saw it. So I'm driving south and this thing is walking north in the direction towards me, on the same side of the road as well. So it was on the passenger side of the truck as we passed. It was walking all the way to the side of the road, but not quite on the grass either. My wife was on her phone as I said, "Did you see that?" She said, "See what?" Now keep this in mind. I just previously mentioned it's pitch black. I haven't seen a car on the side of the road, much less a house or ranch, for the last 10 minutes or so. So I can't really describe. What I saw was a human body with a sheet over it. It seemed to be human legs and feet, but I couldn't really tell because I was going 77 and it happened so fast. But it looked like human skin and flesh from the shins down, including toes. And I watched it as it took 3 or 4 strides. It didn't seem very large in size, maybe 5'9" or 6 feet at best. Not bony, not obese. Also, I didn't see arms. It was literally a whole white sheet looking fabric over its whole body. I mentioned the height because of the Skinwalker talk. But what freaked me out the most is how or why would some sick bastard pull a prank like this? If they did, where did they live? I'm talking about some Jeepers Creepers bus scene back road driving, that kind of empty. Another thing to mention is that the sheet didn't have holes cut out for the eyes, so how did it see in pitch black? And whatever this thing is, how did it know not to walk in the middle of the street? I had so many questions, but I didn't want to freak the wife out, so I just floored it. I started going around 105 and had to calm myself down because I kept looking in the rear view mirror looking for headlights on some Jeepers Creepers shit again. I don't know why I keep referencing that movie because I haven't seen it in like 5 years. But still, here's the best part. I got over it when we got to the family's house and showered and got all settled in. And that's when I went outside to go chill with the family and catch up. And that's when I overheard Steven telling them what happened on the drive over between Mason and Fredericksburg. And that's when every hair on my neck and arms stood up. And it just did again as I'm typing this. The picture is so vivid and the feeling is so real. I looked at Steven and I asked to describe what he saw. and he described exactly what I saw as well. We were so surprised. Again, could it have been some weirdo playing a game? A ghost? How cliche with the whole white sheet thing, right? Or a real serial killer waiting for someone to turn around? I don't know, but for damn sure, I wasn't gonna be the one to ask him if he needed help. So from this day on, I refused to ever drive to or from San Antonio, Texas after dark. Have you ever seen anything like this in South Texas? Comment and let me know. Thank you for reading my true story. Have a great night.